The compass had been useless for hours. Elias knew, with a sinking dread that settled deep in his bones, that he was spectacularly lost. The old, hand-drawn map he'd bought from a shady antique dealer in the Romanian countryside promised a shortcut through the Carpathian foothills to a forgotten Roman ruin. Instead, he had hiked straight into an early, brutal blizzard. The snow, thick and unforgiving, was swallowing the twilight whole. He'd left his heavy winter gear in the car, assuming a quick day trip. Now, the bitter wind was slicing through his lightweight jacket, and his fingers were numb, stiff claws of ice. He needed shelter and fast. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the hypothermia was already setting in, replacing the sharp cold with a dull, dangerous lethargy. Just as he was about to give in and collapse beside a snow-laden pine, he saw it. A flicker of red light, unnaturally warm and steady, tucked between a cluster of jagged ice-coated boulders. It was a small, high-quality mountaineering tent, oddly pitched and glowing faintly from within. A wave of adrenaline, the last gasp of his survival instinct, pushed him forward. He didn't care who owned it. He was going to beg, borrow, or steal a few hours of warmth. He fumbled with the zipper, his movements clumsy. The nylon gave way with a harsh, tearing sound that echoed in the quiet snow. He tumbled inside, half expecting to find a burly hiker or a disgruntled local. What he found was silence, a breathtaking blast of warm air, and the most arresting creature he had ever seen. She was asleep, or at least still. She was curled inside a dark gray expedition-grade sleeping bag, her back against the inner wall of the tent. She wasn't human. Her skin was a luminous, almost pale ivory, and a set of delicate, pointed ears peeked from her midnight dark hair. But it was the wings that stole his breath, immense charcoal-black membranes stretched over bone, currently folded and glistening faintly with the red glow that permeated the tent. She was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly alien. He scrambled backward, knocking over a flask. The noise was loud. Her eyes snapped open. They were the color of molten silver, but now, a flicker of fierce, predatory scarlet ignited in their depths. She moved with impossible speed, a blur of motion. One moment she was asleep, the next, a hand, long-fingered, tipped with nails like polished obsidian, was clamped around his throat, pinning him against the tent floor. "Who are you?" Her voice was low, a dry, melodic hiss that barely disturbed the air, yet resonated in his chest. "How did you find this place, human?" Elias couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. The silver eyes were boring into him, cold and ancient, assessing whether he was worth the bother of killing. "I was lost," he managed to croak, the simple words catching in his constricted throat. "Blizzard. I saw the light. Please." The red glow in her eyes intensified for a moment, then surprisingly dimmed. She didn't release him, but her grip lessened slightly. She studied his face, his blue lips, the involuntary shiver that racked his body despite the tense warmth. "You are freezing," she stated, not as a question but a detached observation, like noting the composition of a rock. "You will die before the sun rises. My name is Lyra. And you are trespassing in the protected territory of the Night Court." She finally withdrew her hand. Elias gasped for air, massaging his neck. He looked at her, noting the strange, glowing white runes painted across her arms and collarbone, the same patterns etched faintly into her cheeks. She was wrapped in a simple tunic, yet she radiated power and an unsettling warmth. "My name is Elias Vance," he whispered, trying to sound less pathetic. "I swear I'm just a history student. I'll leave as soon as the storm breaks." Lyra looked at the tent flap, where the fierce wind was whipping the snow into a frenzy. "The storm will not break for days, human. And if you step outside now, your blood will freeze in your veins before you take 10 steps. I cannot allow you to leave." The way she said "cannot allow" sounded less like a threat and more like a statement of cosmic law. He decided not to argue with the woman who had literal wings and predatory eyes. He watched her as she slowly unwrapped herself from the sleeping bag. He expected her to pull out a weapon or cast a spell. Instead, she reached for a second, rolled-up sleeping bag tucked near her boots. It was identical to the one she had been using. "My species does not feel the cold as you do," Lyra said, her voice dry. "But I have been compromised. A curse. The prolonged exposure to temperatures below the freezing point of blood is currently excruciating. It weakens me faster than I can hunt. I need constant heat to maintain my strength." She threw the spare sleeping bag at him. "Use that. You may live. You may keep your life, Elias Vance. But you will not make a sound, you will not touch my belongings, and you will not stare." Elias grabbed the bag gratefully. It was soft, incredibly insulated, and felt like salvation. He wriggled inside, pulling the zipper all the way up, the heat instantly beginning its slow, painful process of thawing his body. He sighed, a profound, relieved sound. Lyra, however, did not get back into her own sleeping bag. Instead, she sat watching him, her face inscrutable. The red light inside the tent, he now realized, was being emitted by her wings, which pulsed with a soft, protective energy. He closed his eyes, trying to focus on the warmth, trying to ignore the silent, beautiful predator sitting just 5 feet away. The wind howled outside. The cold was a living, malevolent entity trying to find a way into their small sanctuary. After about an hour, just as Elias was starting to drift off, he felt the cold seeping back into the air inside the tent. He opened his eyes. Lyra was trembling. Not violently, but a tiny, controlled tremor that belied her powerful appearance. The red light from her wings was flickering, growing weaker. "My reserves are failing," she murmured, her silvery red eyes fixed on the flapping tent wall. "The cold is too pervasive tonight." She looked at Elias, her expression a mix of fierce pride and desperate need. "I gave you warmth, human," she stated. "Now I will take yours." Before he could react, she moved. She didn't leave the sleeping bag she was in. She just slid it closer to his, and in a single fluid motion, Lyra unzipped Elias's bag just enough, slid her powerful winged body in beside him, and instantly wrapped her arms around his chest. Her skin, even through his shirt, was startlingly hot, burning away the last of the icy chill on his body. She didn't hug him gently, it was a desperate, almost painful grip. She pressed her cheek against his chest, right over his frantically beating heart. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice muffled against his shirt. "My strength returns from the heat of your life, Elias Vance. If you pull away, I promise you the cold will kill us both." His brain, already overwhelmed, couldn't process the danger, only the insane, primal warmth. He was sharing a sleeping bag with a vampire princess. Her sharp, elf-like ear was against his neck. Her enormous, silent wings, still faintly glowing red, encased them both in a cocoon of warmth and shadow. He could feel the strong, unnatural thrum of her heart. She squeezed him tighter, drawing his heat. His body was now a biological furnace for a creature of the night. "Sleep, human," she whispered, her breath tickling his neck. "And do not dream. I would not want to know your secrets yet." Elias lay there, paralyzed, terrified, yet warmer and safer than he had ever felt. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the faint, eerie glow of the runes on her arms, illuminated by the dying embers of the red light. He was a human, sleeping in the same bag as a creature of pure night, high in a frozen, forbidden mountain. And she was hugging him tight as the cold set in. Elias woke up to a warmth so profound it felt like a hallucination. It wasn't just the warmth of the sleeping bag, it was the concentrated, enveloping heat of Lyra's body pressed against his own. They were still entwined, her arms a vice around his middle, her head tucked securely beneath his chin. Her breathing was steady, shallow, and utterly silent. He slowly realized that her warmth was no longer scorching, but a comforting, stable furnace, a stark contrast to the absolute zero outside the tent. He carefully shifted his weight and Lyra stirred instantly. Her grip tightened, but her silver eyes, when they opened, lacked the immediate predatory spark of the night before. They were lucid, calm, and utterly unapologetic. "Good morning, Elias Vance," she murmured, her voice silkier than before, the nocturnal chill having been thoroughly banished from her system. "Your furnace is surprisingly efficient. You survived the night." "You survived the night too," Elias replied, his voice raspy. He realized that the red glow was gone. Lyra's wings were inert, folded like dark banners behind her. The glowing runes on her skin, however, were bright, not red but a cool, pulsating silver. She finally loosened her hold, pulling her upper body back just enough to look at him, but remaining inside the shared warmth of the bag. The intimacy of their position was crushing, a forced proximity that was both terrifying and undeniably thrilling. "The cold is not merely inconvenient for my kind," Lyra explained, a shadow crossing her beautiful, sharp features. "It is an instrument of our ancient enemy. The Sun Elves, long ago, used complex etheric magic to instill a permanent vulnerability in the Night Court's lineage. Prolonged exposure to extreme cold begins a process called the withering. It doesn't kill us immediately, but it drains our blood magic, our physical strength, and eventually, it strips us of our immortality and reduces us to ash." Elias stared at the intricate silver markings on her skin. Are those the runes that are holding back the withering?" Lyra nodded, a slight movement that brought her hair cascading over his shoulder. "They are the bindings of Lyra. A spell placed upon me by my mother, the Queen. They channel external warmth into me, replenishing the depleted ether. Your body heat, Elias, is simply a biological battery I am drawing from. He felt a sudden, profound indignity. So, I'm just a high-efficiency blanket to you. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. A blanket that requires a heart, yes. And blankets do not talk back. But let us be fair. You were moments from death. I granted you sanctuary and warmth. You granted me survival. We have a temporary contract, human. She finally extracted herself from the sleeping bag, moving like liquid shadow. She was impossibly graceful. As she stood, Elias could see the extent of her physical being, tall, lithe, and powerful. The snow outside had stopped, replaced by a blinding, pristine morning. Lyra unzipped the tent flap a crack, peering out. The storm has passed. You may leave now, Elias Vance, she stated, her tone suddenly distant and final. The route back down the mountain is treacherous, but you have the strength of your own heat. Be gone. Elias sat up, pulling on his ice-stiffened jacket. He felt insulted, used, and yet, he didn't move. He looked at Lyra's back, noticing the heavy, fur-lined backpack sitting next to her gear. You can't leave either, can you? He challenged. Lyra slowly turned, her silver eyes narrowing. Explain your impudence. If the cold is that dangerous and those runes are your only defense, why are you out here in a blizzard? You aren't a hiker. You're royalty. You wouldn't risk the withering unless you absolutely had to. You said your power was failing. That means you are far from home and you are running from something, Elias reasoned, the historian's instinct for spotting a vital missing piece of the puzzle kicking in. You don't need my heat anymore, but you need my knowledge of the human world to get you off this mountain safely without attracting attention. That's why you let me live. Lyra remained silent for a long, tense moment, her gaze penetrating. The space between them crackled with unspoken threats. Then she let out a sigh, a sound of supreme irritation and reluctant admission. You are smarter than your shivering appearance suggested, human, she conceded, rubbing the side of her neck where the binding shone the brightest. I am pursuing a relic. An artifact taken from my family's catacombs. It is vital to the stability of the Night Court. My enemies are hunting me, knowing my weakness to the cold. They track the residual heat signature I leave behind. And if I help you get off this mountain and avoid detection, what's my reward? Elias asked, trying to sound brave despite the fear churning in his stomach. Lyra's lip curled slightly. Your life extended. But there is a complication. The artifact, the Crimson Eye of Aethelred, is not merely a treasure. It is a powerful conduit of blood magic. My trackers are closing in, and I cannot risk activating my wings to escape. The burst of etheric energy required would pinpoint our location for leagues. She reached out and lightly brushed her fingers across the back of his hand. Even the brief, casual touch sent a wave of heat through him. You are not a liability, Elias. You are an insulator. Your mundane, non-magical human heat provides a perfect shield, masking my own residual signature. You will serve as my human camouflage, helping me reach the city and find the thief before my enemies find me. Lyra's expression softened, taking on an intensity that made his breath hitch. The moment we leave this tent, the mountain air will begin to drain me again. I will not survive the journey alone. We will need to conserve your heat, Elias. And that means the sleeping arrangement we had tonight? She paused, her silver eyes holding his. Will need to be permanent until we are safe. The silence inside the tent was suddenly charged, suffocating. Elias felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Fear of being tied to a dangerous creature, a primal thrill at the sheer impossibility of the situation, and a grudging sense of necessity. The vampire princess needed him to survive. Permanent, Elias repeated, swallowing hard. You mean, we travel like this? On the mountain? The human term is cuddling, I believe, Lyra said dryly, a flicker of amusement in her silver eyes. She started efficiently packing her specialized gear, folding the dark wings neatly against her back beneath a thick, dark cloak. Your body heat, distributed evenly across mine, acts as a thermal blanket, scattering my magical signature. We cannot risk separation for more than a few moments in this terrain. It's not a suggestion, Elias Vance. It is the condition of your continued existence. Elias zipped up his thin, inadequate jacket. All right, princess. Let's go over the rules of this arrangement. Rule number 1, I get to ask questions. You answer them truthfully. I need to know what kind of enemies we are facing. Lyra paused her packing, her gaze intense. Rule accepted. The enemy are my uncle's trackers, the Night Guard. They are trained assassins of the highest rank, creatures of shadow who can glide across the snow without leaving a trace. Their purpose is to capture me and return the Crimson Eye to my uncle, who seeks to usurp my mother's throne. And rule number 2? Elias pressed. You maintain physical contact with me at all times, Lyra stated simply, finishing her packing and throwing the large heavy backpack over her shoulders with effortless strength. We are moving. It will be slow, dangerous, and very cold. Keep up. Lyra stepped out of the tent first, instantly enveloped by the blinding white light of the snow-covered morning. Elias followed, shivering the instant he stepped into the biting wind. Lyra didn't wait for him to catch up. She simply grabbed his wrist, a cold, strong grip, and pulled him close to her side. Keep your hand on my arm. Right here, she instructed, guiding his gloved hand to the soft fur lining of her cloak, directly over the silver binding runes on her bicep. Keep it flat. Don't wander. Focus on your footing. The descent was brutal. The snow was deceptively deep, hiding icy patches and jagged rocks. Lyra moved with the precision of a trained predator, her feet finding purchase where Elias's boot would slip. He had to practically lean into her, his shoulder pressed against her side, his breath misting the air between them. The proximity was maddening. She was a whirlwind of exotic perfume and primal power, yet he was utterly dependent on her. Hours passed in a grueling, silent trek. Elias was exhausted, his muscles screaming, but the constant, focused connection with Lyra kept the debilitating chill at bay. He realized that the human contact wasn't just shielding her, it was also sharing the warmth she had absorbed, acting as a crucial survival mechanism for him. You said they track heat signatures, Elias panted, trying to match her stride. Are they close? Closer than I like, Lyra replied, her voice low. The air is thin and the energy output of the bindings leaves a faint trace. The trackers are expert in reading ambient etheric disturbances. We must reach the tree line, the shadows will absorb some of the residual energy. Just as they were crossing a narrow, exposed ridge, the silence of the mountain was broken by a sound that sent a jolt of ice through Elias's heart. A high-pitched, resonant whistle, cutting through the wind from the valley below. Lyra stopped instantly, pulling Elias hard behind a wind-sculpted rock formation. She pushed him against the stone, her body shielding his, her cloak pulled tight around them both. They found us, she hissed, her eyes scanning the vast white expanse. The whistle is a signal. 2 teams are converging. We must descend into the ravine now. They expect us to stay high. Ravine? Isn't that riskier? Elias whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. It is covered by the trees and we can move faster, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a near-silent command. But you must be absolutely silent. Do not make a sound. Do not stumble. They scrambled down the steep, rocky slope into the ravine, the sudden sharp decrease in altitude jarring Elias's ears. The air here was damp, heavy, and smelled of pine and frozen earth. They ran, Lyra's hand never leaving his arm, dragging him over obstacles. They were deep among the pines when Lyra froze again, pressing herself and Elias against the rough bark of a giant fir. We have company, she mouthed, pointing with her eyes towards a break in the trees, a few hundred yards away. Elias squinted. 2 figures, tall and impossibly lean, were moving with unnatural speed across the snow. They were dressed in dark, mottled gray, blending perfectly into the shadows and snow. Their faces were hooded, and their eyes, even from this distance, glinted with a cold, malevolent light. They didn't walk, they flowed over the ground. The night guard, Lyra breathed. They are armed with silver-edged blades. They can sever my bindings. We cannot fight them both. One of the trackers suddenly stopped, his head snapping up towards their position. He hadn't seen them, but he was feeling for them. Elias felt a sudden sharp spike of heat from Lyra, a concentrated burst of etheric energy. The binding runes on her arm flared a bright, defensive silver. The tracker smiled, a chilling, predatory smile that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth, and started moving directly toward their hiding spot. He's closing the distance, Elias panicked, trying to find a way out. He looked at the tracker, then at Lyra, whose expression was pure, focused fury. I need a distraction, Lyra whispered urgently. Something large. Something human and clumsy. Give me 10 seconds to mask our trail with a shadowweave. Elias knew he was about to do something utterly stupid, but seeing the tracker closing in, and knowing what would happen if he reached Lyra, he didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath, removed his gloved hand from Lyra's arm, and without another word he pushed off the tree, running in the opposite direction towards a cluster of fallen logs, screaming at the top of his lungs. Hey, look over here, you freaks. The tracker instantly veered away from the fir tree, locking onto the much louder, much simpler human heat source. He burst into a terrifying sprint, gaining ground on Elias in seconds. Lyra didn't move. She didn't call out. She simply watched the human she had adopted as her furnace sprint toward a certain, painful death. She watched the tracker raise his silver blade. And then, just as the tracker was about to strike, Lyra finally moved, unleashing a surge of forbidden power that illuminated the ravine. She had her 10 seconds. Elias ran with a desperate, lung-searing terror, the silver-edged blade of the tracker flashing in his peripheral vision. He threw himself behind a massive, moss-covered log, not fast enough, not far enough. The air above him tore with the force of the tracker's strike, the blade embedding itself in the wood just inches from his head. The tracker, lean and terrifying, pulled the blade free, his cold eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "You have served your purpose, bait," the creature hissed, raising the silver blade for the killing blow. Before the blow could descend, the world changed. A surge of raw, ancient energy, not the soft thermal glow, but a violent, concussive wave of crimson power, erupted from Lyra's hiding spot. The sound was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in Elias's teeth and shook the very trees. Lyra was no longer hiding. She was standing in the open, her dark cloak thrown back, her wings unfurling to their full, terrifying span. They were no longer black. They blazed with a fierce, blood-red light that cast grotesque, dancing shadows across the snow. The silver runes on her body shone with the intensity of molten metal. She hadn't moved to fight, she had moved to dominate. "Return to your master, Shadow," Lyra's voice commanded, amplified and distorted by the etheric surge. It was the voice of a queen, a voice of crushing, inescapable authority. "You trespass upon the protection of the night air. I command you vanish." The vampire princess wasn't using a physical attack. She was using a mental and magical command, flooding the tracker's senses with pure terror. The tracker, caught mid-strike, froze. His malevolent eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing fear. He lowered his blade, slowly dropping to his knees, his body racked with violent convulsions. The power of the command was too much for the lesser creature. In a blink, the tracker dissolved, not into blood or dust, but into a wisp of cold, gray shadow that was instantly absorbed by the surrounding pines. The other tracker, seeing the horrifying display, didn't hesitate. He melted back into the shadows of the ravine, abandoning his partner's position in a desperate retreat. The crimson light surrounding Lyra dimmed, the intense redness draining from her wings. She stood for a moment, chest heaving, the powerful magic visibly taxing her. The glow on her silver bindings was now dangerously faint, almost invisible. She had overextended her powers, violating the very protection the bindings were meant to provide. Elias scrambled out from behind the log, shaking uncontrollably, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm. He ran to her, not caring about the danger or the supernatural power she wielded. He saw only the beautiful woman struggling to remain standing. "Lyra, what did you do? Are you all right?" She swayed, her eyes flickering. The edges of her skin looked pale, almost translucent. "I used the call of the Blood Queen," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "It is forbidden, a total expenditure of my stored ether. It eliminates my enemies, but it consumes my heat reserves instantly. The bindings are barely functioning. I am succumbing." Before she could finish, her knees buckled. Elias caught her just as she fell, her surprisingly light body slumping against his chest. Her wings, now dull and heavy, brushed his back. He could feel the terrifying, sudden cold radiating from her skin. The withering was setting in rapidly. He knew what he had to do. There was no time to find the tent. He half-dragged, half-carried her behind the massive log where he had taken cover. He ripped open his own flimsy jacket and forced himself to tear open the inner lining of her heavy cloak, exposing her bare skin where the bindings were carved. Working with frantic speed, he unzipped his sleeping bag and shoved her inside, immediately scrambling in after her. This time there was no hesitation, no conversation, no forced proximity. It was a race against death. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, pulling her stiff, cold body flush against the entirety of his own. He pressed his cheek to her head, trying to transfer every atom of heat from his core into hers. "I need your warmth, Elias," Lyra breathed, her voice barely audible, the words scraping out like ice on stone. "More than before. I am fading." Elias squeezed her tighter, pouring his fear and his life force into the embrace. Take it all, Lyra. You saved me. Now I save you." He lay there for a long time, listening to the agonizingly slow rhythm of her heart, waiting for his body heat to win the battle against the cold magic. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying cold radiating from her lessened, replaced by a grateful warmth. The bindings on her arm began to glow faintly, not silver but a delicate, reviving gold. Hours passed. When Lyra finally stirred, the sun was casting long shadows through the pine trees. She looked up at Elias, their faces separated by mere inches. His shirt was soaked with their combined sweat and the residual condensation of the extreme temperature difference. "You are stronger than you appear, human," Lyra said, her voice restored, yet softer than before. Her silver eyes were filled with an unreadable mixture of gratitude and profound shame. "No human has ever willingly given so much heat to a member of the Night Court. You risked your life for mine." "You saved mine first," Elias retorted, slightly breathless from the closeness. "And you used forbidden magic for 10 seconds of distraction. What was the price?" Lyra pushed back slightly, allowing just enough space for them to breathe freely, but she did not leave the comfort of his embrace. "The price is simple, Elias. The call not only depletes my ether, it disrupts the magical tracking field I leave. For the next 3 days my enemies cannot track me through magic. But to fully recover my strength and to keep the bindings charged, I must remain in constant, unbroken physical contact with a stable heat source." She looked directly into his eyes, her expression solemn. "We are now bonded by necessity, Elias. Not just a contract. If we separate before the bindings fully stabilize, I will perish. And when I perish, the surge of dying ether will take you with me." They were no longer two people sharing a sleeping bag for convenience. They were two destinies inextricably woven together. The chilling truth settled between them. Elias was now her anchor and she was his curse. "All right, Lyra," Elias said, exhaling slowly, accepting the terrifying truth. 3 days. We stay together. But now you tell me everything about this Crimson Eye, and how we are going to get off this mountain without running into any more of your family's assassins." The necessity of their shared sleeping bag became their reality. They broke camp just as the sun climbed high enough to melt the frost from the pine needles. Lyra, still recovering from the magical expenditure, was weak. She packed the gear, but she relied on Elias to be her continuous source of warmth. Their new method of travel was awkward and intimate. Lyra kept one arm firmly around Elias's waist, her hand tucked beneath his jacket where his body heat was most concentrated. His arm, in turn, was wrapped over her shoulder, securing the heavy folds of her cloak around them both. They moved as one unit, a strange two-bodied creature stumbling through the forest. Elias had never been so aware of another person. He felt the subtle shift of her muscles as she moved, the rhythm of her careful breathing, the delicate scent of pine and something ancient, something like cool copper, emanating from her skin. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was being slowly eroded by the intense, undeniable connection their survival demanded. "The Crimson Eye of Aethelred," Elias began, finally breaking the long silence as they navigated a winding deer trail. "What is it exactly? A gem?" "It is far more than a gem," Lyra replied, her voice soft, her cheek close to his ear. "It is the focal point of all the Night Court's stored blood magic. It isn't used for combat, Elias. It is the core of our generational immortality. It captures and recycles the ether of every member of the royal line when they pass, ensuring the continuity of our power and extending the life of the Queen." "And your uncle wants it," Elias concluded. "He wants to break the cycle," Lyra confirmed, a deep-seated anger momentarily replacing her exhaustion. "He believes my mother, the Queen, is too soft, too focused on maintaining the fragile treaties with the Sun Elves and the human realm. If he possesses the eye, he can drain its power in a single ritual. The ether would be his, making him virtually unstoppable, and the entire Night Court lineage would begin to decay, a mass withering far worse than the cold can inflict." Elias stumbled slightly, adjusting his grip on her. "So, if we fail, your entire family line dies. And the human world suffers the chaos that follows," Lyra added, looking ahead with grim determination. "The balance is delicate, Elias. My uncle has no patience for delicacy." They continued their descent until the terrain leveled out into dense woodland. They hadn't seen any more of the night guard, but the silence felt heavy, watchful. "Where is the thief now?" Elias asked. "You must have a target." "I tracked the thief's signature for weeks," Lyra explained. "He is not a member of the Night Court. He is a mercenary, a rogue mage named Kalin. He is currently hiding in the nearest human city, Brasov, a major transportation hub, perfect for vanishing." Brasov. Elias knew the city. It was large, historic, and bustling, the exact opposite of their quiet, snow-covered mountain refuge. Operating unseen in a city of over 100,000 people, while constantly tethered to a winged vampire princess, seemed an impossible task. "We need a change of clothes, proper gear and a vehicle," Elias stated, his historian's mind shifting into strategic mode. "We can't walk into a city center wearing fur cloaks and carrying an expedition pack. The moment we enter human civilization, the danger increases exponentially," Lyra warned. "Humans are easily swayed by fear and gold. My uncle's agents are everywhere, disguised and waiting." As they emerged from the dense canopy, they saw the road, a narrow, paved lane dusted with snow, flanked by electricity poles. It was a lifeline back to the world. "We need to find the nearest village, get a signal, and find transport to Brasov," Elias decided. Lyra stopped, pulling him to a halt. Her silvery red eyes were focused intently on a small, dark object half buried in the snow on the edge of the road. "Wait," she whispered, her voice tightening with dread. "My uncle's trackers leave a calling card for their targets. It is a sign that they know where we are headed." She bent down, her arm never leaving Elias's body, and retrieved the object. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, a stylized, skeletal bat. "This is not a message for me," Lyra said, her gaze dark. "It is a message for the thief, Kalin. It means my uncle's guard have already tracked the Crimson Eye's residual energy to Brasov, and they are preparing to intercept Kalin before we even arrive. They are planning a trap." Lyra's desperation was palpable. Her grip on Elias's waist tightened painfully. "We are too late, Elias," she admitted, the weight of her entire civilization resting on her shoulders. "They will seize the eye, or Kalin will sell it to the highest bidder before we can find him. Our only chance is speed." She looked at the wooden figurine, then back at Elias, her beautiful face a mask of fierce resolution. "I need to use my wings," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The bindings are still weak and the magical trace will be enormous. It will give away our position to every creature of the night court within 100 miles. But we can cover the distance to the city in minutes. It is the only way to beat the trackers." Elias knew the risk. If she used her wings, she'd drain herself again, potentially collapsing the bindings permanently, and they'd be instantly hunted by every enemy she had. But they had no other choice. "Do it," Elias said, making the insane decision without hesitation. He tightened his own grip around her, preparing for the inevitable terrifying surge of heat and power. "But we are not separating. I am your shield, Lyra. You keep me inside your cloak, you fly close to the canopy, and you go fast. We hit the city and vanish into the crowd." Lyra nodded, her lips curving into a feral, appreciative smile. She dropped the skeletal bat figurine, and with a gasp of pure raw ether, her enormous dark wings snapped open, instantly filling with the pulsating, telltale crimson light that was both her greatest power and her deepest vulnerability. The sound of the wind whipping around the suddenly powerful membranes was deafening. Before Elias could fully grasp the change, Lyra lifted him effortlessly off the ground, clutching him tightly to her body. The world dissolved into a dizzying blur of wind and trees, the mountain rapidly shrinking beneath them as the vampire princess flew towards the waiting, unsuspecting city. Elias was airborne, wrapped in the searing heat and the crimson shadows of Lyra's wings, flying straight into the eye of the storm. The flight was a sensory overload, a deafening roar of wind, the blurring tapestry of the Carpathian landscape below, and the searing, protective heat of Lyra. Elias clung to her, buried in the folds of her cloak and the shadow of her crimson-lit wings, feeling every powerful beat of the ancient, magically charged muscles. The speed was terrifying, but the absolute safety of her embrace was strangely calming. After what felt like a lifetime but was only minutes, Lyra began her controlled descent. The crimson light radiating from her faded to a dull, throbbing ember, and the great wings retracted and folded with a weary rustle. She landed them expertly in a deserted, overgrown section of the Brasov city cemetery, far from the main streets, amidst crumbling stone mausoleums and thick, sheltering cypress trees. The landing jarred Elias, making him acutely aware of his exhaustion and the painful bruising from their shared sleeping bag ordeal. Lyra immediately pulled them both further into the shadows of a large crypt. "We are here," Lyra whispered, her voice rough, the flight having taken a heavy toll. Her silver bindings were barely visible, their golden hue almost entirely gone. The etheric surge was massive. "The trackers will know our general location, but they won't have a precise lock for a few hours. We have to move." She looked at Elias, her eyes serious. "We are in the human realm now, Elias. We must blend in. You are our key. The closer we are to civilization, the faster my enemies can disguise themselves and the slower I become in a crowd. We are still not separating." Lyra's hand went into her inner cloak pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She opened it, revealing a surprisingly thick roll of euros and a few ancient-looking ornate coins. My travel funds, she explained. We need clothes and we need a place to hide. Find the nearest human market. Do not leave my side. Elias quickly examined his surroundings. The cemetery was on the outskirts, but he could see the distant, familiar red-tiled roofs and the towering spire of the Black Church. The main square is too visible. We need the local backstreets. We should find a small hostel or a cheap rental room first, somewhere with low security. They left the shadows of the cemetery, Lyra pulling her thick, travel-stained cloak tight around them both. They walked awkwardly, pressed together like lovers in the cold morning, Elias steering and interpreting the mundane human world, Lyra observing everything with the fierce, alien intensity of a predator in an unfamiliar terrain. The first challenge was immediate: people. Every person they passed glanced at the strange pair. The man huddled too closely to the woman in the oversized strange coat. Elias felt a blush creeping up his neck. This was more than forced intimacy, it was forced public exhibition. Loosen your grip, Lyra, Elias muttered under his breath, navigating a busy street corner. You're drawing attention. People don't walk around like this. Lyra merely adjusted her stance, tucking her head closer to his shoulder to hide her pointed ears beneath the cowl. I am drawing heat, Elias. The bindings are not stable. They require the full, concentrated warmth of your body. If they fail, I fail. I prefer curious glances over ash. She was right. The moment he tried to create a few inches of distance, he felt a sudden, sharp cold radiating from her skin, a terrifying sign of the withering returning. He instantly tightened his arm around her, pulling her close again, resigning himself to the strange performance. They found a small, discreet market street where Elias quickly bought the essentials. A cheap, functional backpack, a pair of nondescript jeans and a hoodie for himself, and a long, simple dark wool dress and jacket for Lyra. He changed quickly in a cramped public restroom, keeping the sleeping bag hidden, while Lyra waited right outside the door, leaning against the wall, her eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk. When he emerged, she stepped into the restroom without a word. When Lyra emerged moments later, she looked different, but no less striking. The long wool dress and simple jacket hid the lines of her powerful body and, crucially, completely concealed her folded wings and the silver bindings. She had braided her dark hair, and only the exquisite sharpness of her features and the unnerving silver of her eyes gave her away. Better? Elias asked. More anonymous, Lyra conceded, pulling up the hood of her jacket. Now we find our lair. And you tell me about this human internet you use to find locations. Elias, using his phone, quickly located a small, cash-only rental apartment on the third floor of an old building near the train station, a place with high turnover and few questions. The location was risky, but close to transportation routes, which Kalin the thief would likely use. They paid the elderly landlord cash and finally they were alone inside a single, small room. Elias immediately threw the sleeping bag onto the floor. We have about 2 hours before your trackers can triangulate the general area, Elias said, looking around the small space. We need a plan. What's the Crimson Eye's signature look like? How do we find Kalin? Lyra sat on the floor, leaning her back against the wall, clearly exhausted. The mundane task of walking in a crowd had drained her residual energy. She pulled Elias down with her, his warmth the first thing she sought. The Crimson Eye is a stone the size of a human fist, she explained, resting her head against his shoulder. It pulses with a faint, internal red light, even when dormant. But Kalin will not keep it dormant. He will be attempting to sell it or activate it to escape. We must find the locations where powerful, unregistered magic is dealt. Black market, occult shops, maybe an auction house, Elias mused, his mind racing, trying to compartmentalize the reality that he was brainstorming a fantasy heist with a vampire princess. Just then Lyra's head snapped up. She tensed, her eyes fixed on the single thin window of the rental room. Silence, she commanded, her voice a low hiss. I hear them. They are moving faster than I anticipated. The trackers have split up. 2 teams. They are sweeping the area around the cemetery. The danger was immediate, but Lyra's face held a look of sudden, terrifying realization, not just of the immediate threat, but of a deeper, more insidious conspiracy. Wait, she breathed, her grip tightening on Elias's arm, causing him a genuine flash of pain. The skeletal bat. The trap was not for Kalin alone. My uncle is using this as an opportunity. They didn't just track the eye. They were waiting for me to use my wings. Her eyes locked on his, filled with a sudden, devastating certainty. Elias, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The rental contract we signed, the cash we paid. My uncle's reach is deep. The entire city is a net. If they are this close, this fast, it means they already knew we were coming to Brasov. The sudden realization that they had walked into a meticulously set trap hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He looked around the cramped, ordinary room. The cheap wallpaper, the flimsy curtains, the smell of dust and old wood, it all felt suffocating. The landlord, Elias whispered, his eyes wide. The old man who rented us the room, he must have been one of them. He took the cash, noted our appearance and signaled the trackers. Lyra's grip on his arm was desperate, but her mind was already calculating escape routes. It wasn't the cash, Elias. It was the etheric signature I emitted when I flew. They just needed confirmation that I was entering the city, and the landlord was the final trigger. They are not waiting for us to make a mistake, they are waiting for us to step outside. She pushed him toward the window. We are on the 3rd floor. Too high for a simple jump, but the ground team is too close for the stairs. Is there an adjacent building? Elias peered through the gap in the curtains. The buildings were close, but there was a treacherous 2-foot alleyway separating their window ledge from the next roofline. Risky. We'd need to climb out the window, shimmy across the ledge and jump the gap to the roof. Risk is relative, Lyra said, already moving. She grabbed their single shared sleeping bag, rolling it tightly. The cold is closing in. Every minute spent planning is a minute closer to the bindings failing. We move now. She unzipped the heavy-duty sleeping bag and secured it around Elias's waist with a series of quick, practiced knots. She pulled the excess material taut, creating a thick, insulated harness. You go first, she instructed, her silver eyes blazing with urgency. Climb onto the ledge. I will hold the end of the bag. You are tied to me. If you slip, I will pull you back. But you must hold fast to my heat. Elias didn't argue. He knew that for her to give up her precious insulation was a sign of extreme desperation. He climbed awkwardly onto the narrow, icy ledge. The wind, even slightly reduced by the surrounding buildings, was biting. Ready, Lyra, he called out softly. Do not look down, Elias, she commanded from the safety of the room. And do not let go of the sleeping bag. It is our lifeline and our tether. He started inching along the ledge, his back scraping the rough brick wall. The feeling of the thick material of the sleeping bag taut against his waist, connecting him physically to Lyra, was terrifyingly reassuring. He felt her heat, a continuous, stable warmth that pulsed through the material, keeping his fear from turning into paralysis. When he reached the gap, he took a deep breath and leaped. He landed hard on the neighboring roof, sliding on the slick tiles but immediately scrambling for purchase. The second he was stable, Lyra pulled the rope, drawing the slack back into the room. Your turn, Elias whispered into the thin air. Lyra didn't wait. She emerged onto the ledge with fluid, effortless grace, moving with the balance of a mountain cat. She quickly crossed the narrow gap and landed beside him. The moment her hand touched his shoulder, Elias felt the surge of reviving warmth. They were safe for now. They crossed the network of rooftops, moving away from the area, using the height to spot any dark figures below. Lyra led them into the maze of the city's old town, finally finding refuge in a dark, vaulted archway leading down to the cellars of an ancient wine merchant. The deeper we go, the harder they will find a magical signature, Lyra stated, pulling the heavy door open. The cellar was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of earth and fermentation, but it was silent and dark. They found a sheltered alcove amidst stacks of dusty old wine crates. Lyra immediately pulled Elias into the sleeping bag cocoon, her exhaustion now dangerously apparent. Her arms wrapped around him, drawing his heat greedily. The bindings on her arm pulsed, weak but stable. Thank you, Elias, she murmured, her face pressed against his chest. We are now truly underground. The shadows here are ours. We can't stay long, Elias reminded her, trying to ignore the fierce intimacy of their situation. We need to find Kalin before your uncle does. How do we find a rogue mage in a city this size? Lyra closed her eyes, recovering her breath. Kalin is not discreet. He will be attempting to use the Crimson Eye to draw a high-ranking buyer. The eye emits a powerful magical resonance when activated. If he is showing it off, it will leave a trace. I must find a source of ambient ether, a place of old power, to listen for that resonance. Elias thought for a moment. He was a history student. He knew Brasov's landmarks. The Black Church. Biserica Nigra. It's built on a pre-Christian Dacian site, huge power source, ancient stones. It's the most magically potent landmark in the city. Lyra's eyes snapped open, blazing with renewed focus. Perfect. A cathedral built on ancient power. We go tonight under the deepest cover of darkness. But first we need a clue about Kalin's operation. He must have left a trace. Elias scanned the cellar, looking at the thousands of wine crates, then he noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked between a bottle and a wall. It looked out of place, slightly newer than the dust around it. He pulled it out. It was a faded, handwritten note in archaic Romanian, detailing a transaction. Elias translated the key phrase under his breath. It's a delivery receipt for a special consignment. The drop-off location is a place called the Old Goldsmith's Alley, and the receiver uses the code, the Serpent's Tooth. Lyra sat up straight, her expression grim. The Serpent's Tooth. That is Kalin's known trademark. He is here and he is selling the Crimson Eye tonight. The Goldsmith's Alley is famous among the criminal element for its discreet, high-stakes transactions. It's not a market, Elias. It's a private auction. The danger was no longer abstract. It was a time-sensitive, high-stakes collision course. The vampire princess and the human shield were now facing a rogue mage and a network of assassins in the heart of the city. We move at midnight, Lyra declared, her voice cold with resolve. I need your warmth until then. We are going to that auction and we are getting the Crimson Eye back. Midnight in Brasov was cold, quiet, and deceptively beautiful. The cobbled streets of the old town were slick with frost, reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights. Lyra and Elias moved like a single shadow, still bound by the sleeping bag harness beneath their borrowed clothes. Lyra insisted on maintaining the intimate tether, knowing that even a moment of separation in the open air could crash the bindings. Their journey from the cellar to the Black Church, Biserica Nigra, was a study in concealed tension. Elias walked with the practiced stride of a confident local, using his height and bulk to subtly shield Lyra from passing eyes. Lyra, her head down, moved with the rigid, focused grace of a stalking animal. Her hand was constantly tucked into his coat, pressed against his side where his heart beat a steady rhythm, the rhythm of her survival. As they approached the massive, soot-blackened stone walls of the Black Church, Elias felt a strange, humming pressure in the air. The church, towering above the square, felt less like a monument and more like a battery, a repository of centuries of collective human belief and ancient, pre-existing energy. The resonance is strong here, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant clock chime. She pulled them into the deep shadow of an adjacent tower. The power in these stones is immense. It should be enough to amplify my senses. I need to listen for the echo of the Crimson Eye. Oh. Elias asked, keeping a wary eye on the deserted square. By touching the stone, Lyra replied, her silver eyes fixed on the immense church wall. I must channel the ambient ether through my bindings. But this will require concentration and I must not be disturbed. This is highly risky, Elias. The power surge will be contained, but any experienced tracker within a mile will feel the ripple. Lyra positioned herself with her back pressed flat against the rough, cold stone. She slowly and carefully pulled her jacket and the sleeping bag material away from her right forearm, exposing the glowing, faint gold of the bindings. She then pressed her arm flat against the ancient, cold stone of the church. A soft, audible hiss emanated from the contact point. Elias watched, mesmerized, as the bindings on her arm flared, drawing energy from the depths of the earth. The golden light intensified, running like liquid fire through the carved runes. Lyra's face became completely blank, her gaze distant and inward, as if her consciousness had left her body. Elias stood guard, his body positioned to completely shield her from the streetlights and the view of any high window. The clock ticked, each second feeling like an hour. He could feel Lyra's body temperature dropping dangerously as her ether was poured into the task. He pressed himself harder against her, focusing his entire being on being a thermal wall. After what felt like an eternity, Lyra gasped, and the golden light on her arm instantly extinguished, leaving the bindings a dull, fragile silver. She pulled her arm away from the stone, her hand shaking violently, and hastily covered it. I found it, she said, her voice strained but victorious. Kalin is not in the old goldsmith's alley itself. He is in the tunnels beneath it. There is an old, abandoned etheric node, a power source, down there. He is using the eye to charge that node, and the pulse is acting as a beacon for the buyers. The tunnels? Like the catacombs? Elias asked, relief mixing with fresh dread. Yes. And he is surrounded by a dense, shifting veil of dark magic, a defensive ward. We must enter through the alley. The auction will have started by now. We are dangerously late. Lyra quickly resecured the sleeping bag harness and pulled her hood tight. What about your uncle's trackers? They felt the pulse from the church, Lyra admitted, her jaw tight. They are converging on this area now. We must move. But Elias, Kalin's ward is strong. My bindings are too weak to break through. I will need all the energy I have left. Lyra led them through the narrow, twisting lanes of the old town, navigating with an unnerving, innate sense of direction until they reached the famous goldsmith's alley. It was a narrow, picturesque corridor of medieval workshops, all shuttered and dark. Only one, an unassuming, unmarked door at the very end of the alley, had a faint, almost invisible light bleeding from its seams. The entrance, Lyra hissed, pulling them close to the grimy wall. The buyers are already inside. We will enter through the back. The back door will have only one guard, Elias. You will distract him. I will use the remaining ether in my bindings for a short, sharp burst to paralyze him. We have moments to get inside. Paralyze? Not eliminate? Eliminate leaves a trace, Lyra said grimly. Paralysis conserves my heat. It will last only 20 seconds. Make them count. They slipped into the narrow, dark passage behind the building. A single hulking figure in a cheap, dark suit was smoking a cigarette by a heavy oak door, his head nodding slightly in boredom. Lyra stopped, pressing her entire body flush against Elias. He felt the terrifying, familiar surge of energy as she prepared to expend her last reserves. Now, Elias, Lyra commanded, her voice fierce. Talk to him. Get his full attention. And remember, do not let go of me. We enter together. Elias took a deep breath, fixing his focus on the guard. He still had Lyra's arms tightly wrapped around his waist, hidden beneath his jacket. He was about to walk into an auction of the apocalypse, tethered to a vampire princess. He stepped out of the shadows, looking as harmless and lost as possible. Excuse me, sir. Elias called out, his voice shaking slightly. I'm lost. Could you possibly tell me where the nearest train station is? My wife is absolutely freezing out here. The guard, irritated by the interruption, lowered his cigarette and turned fully towards Elias. That was Lyra's cue. With a soundless gasp, a powerful spike of cold energy shot from the bindings on her arm, instantly overloading the guard's nervous system. The guard froze mid-snarl, his eyes wide and vacant, his body rigid as stone. 20 seconds, Lyra urged, dragging Elias towards the oak door. She was visibly weakened, leaning heavily against him, her borrowed warmth draining rapidly. Elias shoved the heavy door open and practically carried Lyra into the deep, echoing darkness of the service tunnel. They were inside, but the cost was high. Lyra's bindings were now dangerously close to failure, and the tunnel entrance immediately began to glow faintly with the residual power of the Crimson Eye. The heat is immense here, Lyra whispered, pulling him down a crumbling staircase. It is drawing me, Elias. I can feel the eye. We are close. But we must be careful. The buyers are not human. They are far more dangerous. The crumbling staircase opened into a vast, circular chamber deep beneath the city, a forgotten crypt adapted for a darker commerce. The air here was thick, heavy with the stench of stale blood and ozone, and dangerously hot. The combined body heat of the assembled supernatural creatures was a suffocating blanket, yet Elias felt Lyra shiver against him. She was feeding on his warmth, stabilizing her system against the magical turbulence of the room. Elias and Lyra slipped behind a tall, granite pillar, their bodies fused together by the sleeping bag harness beneath their coats. They remained perfectly still, observing the scene. The chamber was dimly lit by flickering, magically enchanted torches casting huge, distorted shadows on the vaulted ceilings. In the center, standing on a raised platform carved from black marble, was the thief, Kalin. Kalin was a spectacle. He was a tall, thin man in a coat of shimmering emerald velvet, his long, greasy black hair tied back with a gold clasp. He carried himself with an arrogant, reckless confidence. In his hand, resting on a pedestal of carved bone, was the prize, the Crimson Eye of Aethelred. It was breathtaking. The size of a large human fist, the stone was a solidified mass of deep, throbbing ruby, but its true power lay in the way it moved. It didn't just glow, it pulsed like a colossal ancient heart beating with pure, concentrated blood magic. The heat emanating from it was so intense that Elias could feel it on his face even from the shadows. Around the platform, sitting on mismatched thrones and velvet chairs, were the bidders. Lyra had warned Elias they weren't human, but the reality was far more disturbing. There were 3-foot-tall pale creatures with massive shimmering insect eyes, hulking figures wrapped in heavy black cloth who seemed to shift and ripple in the light, and a regal, stunningly beautiful woman with skin the color of twilight and horns that curled like rams across her forehead, likely a powerful member of the Shadow Fae. Gods, Elias breathed, whispering the word against Lyra's ear. This is insane. They're all monstrous. Dangerous, Lyra corrected, her voice tight with controlled fury. These are entities of immense power. They are here because the Crimson Eye will grant them generational stability. Kalin is not selling a gem, Elias. He is selling the stability of an entire civilization. Kalin tapped the pedestal with a silver-tipped cane, his voice amplified by magic. Gentlemen, ladies, and whatever you call yourselves. The bidding is high, but the prize is priceless. Do not forget, this artifact provides not just power, but eternity. Now where were we? 1,000 years of service from the Shadow Do I hear a counteroffer? Lyra squeezed Elias's arm, her eyes fixed on the eye. I can't wait for the auction to finish. If that artifact leaves this room in the hands of the Fae or a demon lord, it will ignite a war between the realms. I must take it now. We can't fight them all, Lyra. You're too weak, Elias pleaded, his body aching from the strain. I won't fight them, Lyra said, her lips curving into a predatory smile that chilled Elias to the bone. I will steal it. The ambient ether here is so thick, it is suppressing Kalin's protective wards. If you can get me to the edge of the platform, I can use the last remaining charge in my bindings for a short-range kinetic teleport. The plan was suicide. Teleportation required a massive, instantaneous energy expenditure, guaranteeing the complete failure of the bindings. If you teleport, the bindings will fail, Elias stressed. You'll be ash before I can get to you. The proximity of the Crimson Eye is our only chance, Lyra argued fiercely. Its sheer power might stabilize me long enough for me to escape with it. We move during the next bid. When Kalin is distracted. Before they could even plan their movement, a sudden, cold wave of energy swept through the chamber, extinguishing several torches and causing the powerful bidders to stir nervously. It was a familiar cold. Lyra's head snapped up, her silver eyes widening in pure horror. The night guard, she hissed, pulling Elias deeper into the shadow. They found the residual trace from the paralysis spell and the thermal echo from the flight. They are in the tunnels. And they are not alone. Just then, a secondary passage near the entrance burst open. It wasn't just a lone tracker. It was a contingent of 5 figures in dark, silent armor. The elite night guard, led by a tall, imposing figure whose black armor bore the intricate, ornate crest of Lyra's traitorous uncle. The leader was holding the skull of a large, monstrous animal, which pulsed with dark ether. The Bone Seeker, Lyra whispered, her voice tight with despair. He is one of my uncle's most lethal hunters. He can smell royal blood. The trap was set for both Kalin and me. We're surrounded. Kalin, seeing the armed assassins burst into his auction, did not panic. He merely smiled, raising his silver-tipped cane. Gentlemen, it seems we have a few unexpected and rather rude latecomers. Kalin announced with a theatrical flourish. It appears our little gathering has turned into a hostile takeover. Which means the price of the Crimson Eye has just gone up dramatically. The Bone Seeker leader pointed directly at the pillar where Lyra and Elias were hiding, his skull staff glowing ominously. Princess Lyra. His voice boomed, chillingly amplified. Your life ends tonight. And that human is already dead. Lyra shoved Elias against the stone, her hand fumbling to unclip the harness inside their jackets. The plan is abandoned, Elias. Lyra commanded, her silver eyes filled with desperate decision. There is no time for the eye. They will take us both. When I give the word, you run for the exit. Do not look back. Your mission is to survive and return to the surface. I'm not leaving you. Elias protested, tightening his own grip on her. You have no choice. Lyra snapped. I cannot allow them to capture my mother's heir. I must face them. Go. The Bone Seeker and his guard began to advance, swords drawn, while the monstrous bidders remained seated, enjoying the unexpected spectacle of the princess's capture. Lyra took a deep, shuddering breath, her frail, golden bindings igniting one last time. It wasn't the crimson power of the call. It was a faint, blue, shimmering light, the last, dying ember of her heat magic. Now Elias. Lyra screamed, suddenly pushing him with all her might. Go. Elias stumbled out from behind the pillar, exposed to the terrifying lights and the monstrous assembly. The Bone Seeker, seeing the human, snarled in delight and diverted his attention, moving to intercept the easy target. But Lyra had not given up. As Elias ran, Lyra used the final charge of the blue light, not for a teleportation spell, but for a single blinding flash of light, a magical flare, directly into the faces of the advancing night guard. Lyra, left alone and completely exposed, collapsed to her knees, her bindings extinguished forever. She was instantly consumed by the biting, magical cold of the chamber. But Elias was running, the heat of her desperate sacrifice still clinging to his clothes. The blue light of Lyra's desperate final flare burned out instantly, plunging the vast chamber into deeper shadow. Elias was running, the terror a cold, sharp knife in his guts. He didn't look back, but the sound of the Bone Seeker's roar, followed by the clatter of armored boots, told him his temporary reprieve was over. He scrambled up the crumbling stone stairs, ignoring the pain in his knees and the tightness in his chest. The main exit door, the one guarded by the paralyzed man, was too far. He veered left into a narrow, dark maintenance tunnel Lyra had pointed out earlier as a secondary escape route. The tunnel was barely shoulder width, choked with centuries of dirt and old water pipes. Elias didn't slow down. The thought of Lyra, cold, exposed, and now in the custody of her uncle's most brutal assassins, was a fresh surge of adrenaline. Why did she push me? Why sacrifice herself for a human? He realized the answer lay in their shared time. Lyra didn't sacrifice herself for him. She sacrificed herself for the mission. If she was captured with the Crimson Eye, her uncle won on all fronts. By throwing Elias out, she forced him to become the last player in the game. Elias touched the spot beneath his coat where the sleeping bag harness had been. It was gone. In the moment of separation, Lyra hadn't just pushed him, she had unclipped the harness. The sleeping bag, their symbol of survival and intimacy, was now left behind, maybe as a decoy, maybe as the final evidence of their journey. He was shivering violently. The warmth he'd borrowed from Lyra was dissipating quickly in the cold, damp tunnels. He needed to get out, find his phone, and plan. He finally burst out of the tunnel and found himself in another, smaller cellar, this one smelling of coal and damp fabric. He scrambled up a set of rickety wooden stairs and shoved open a flimsy door, emerging into a narrow, deserted street behind a row of old houses. He was several blocks away from Goldsmith's Alley. He stopped, gasping for air, leaning against a cold wall. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He had to keep moving, find a landmark, and get off the backstreets. As he moved, he heard a sound, not the heavy, thundering sound of the night guard's armor, but a quiet, rhythmic scratching coming from the alleyway he'd just exited. Elias flattened himself against the shadows of a parked van. Peering around the corner, he saw the Bone Seeker. The tracker was not pursuing him. He was performing a careful, unnerving search of the tunnel entrance. He was sniffing the air, his grotesque skull staff scraping the brickwork. The Bone Seeker stopped, his body tensing, and he began to move away from the tunnel, towards the street where Elias was hiding. He wasn't tracking Elias's physical trail. He was tracking the residual thermal signature that had just separated from Lyra's own. Elias had been Lyra's human insulator, but now that he was free, he was a walking thermal beacon, a target that smelled exactly like the princess. The Bone Seeker stopped right in front of the van, his back to Elias. The armored giant stood motionless for a moment, then he let out a low, guttural snarl of disappointment. He turned, and Elias saw him remove a small, dark device from his belt, a compass that wasn't pointing north. The Bone Seeker tapped the compass. The heat is too fragmented. The bindings are extinguished. The princess is secured. Return to the main exit. We are to meet the master at the citadel. Citadel. That was the medieval fortress overlooking Brasov. Lyra was being taken there. The Bone Seeker moved away, disappearing back down the street. Elias waited 5 full minutes, his body shaking from cold and shock before he dared to move. He finally got a signal on his phone. He had 2 key pieces of information. Lyra was captured and she was being taken to the Brasov citadel. Elias knew the mission had changed from protection to rescue. He was no longer the human shield, he was the human asset. He had the knowledge of the human world, the ability to move freely, and a deep-seated connection to Lyra that went beyond mere survival. He didn't have armor, he didn't have magic, and he didn't have the vampire princess's warmth. All he had was a stolen hoodie, a cell phone, and the absolute certainty that he was the only chance Lyra had. He pulled his hood tight, forcing the shivering to stop. He had to go to the citadel, which was currently under heavy surveillance by the night guard. But first he needed allies. Lyra had mentioned the rogue mage, Kalin, was going to sell the Crimson Eye. With the night guard intervening, the auction was clearly sabotaged. Kalin would have escaped with the eye, furious and desperate to still make his sale. Elias knew Kalin was a rogue element, dangerous and volatile. But he was Lyra's enemy's enemy, and he was the one holding the Crimson Eye. Elias pulled up a map of the city. He needed to find a place where a desperate mage would hide a world-ending artifact after a failed auction. The nearest place of high-value, secret transactions was the old clock tower, overlooking the main square. Elias started walking, no longer running, but moving with the cold, focused resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. He had lost his shield, his warmth, and his tether. Now he was going to get them back. Elias moved with a cold, desperate clarity that belied his fear. The physical warmth that Lyra had gifted him was gone, replaced by a deep, aching cold in his core, a constant reminder of her absence and the extinguished bindings. He reached the main square just as the first gray light of dawn touched the spires. The old clock tower, rising prominently above the square, was his destination. He found a cafe that had just opened, ordered a weak coffee he didn't taste and watched the tower. He needed to be invisible, yet constantly observing. He remembered Lyra's words. Kalin was arrogant, volatile, and would be furious about the failed auction. He would seek a secure, high-visibility spot to regroup and try to contact new buyers. After an hour of tense surveillance, Elias spotted him. Kalin, the thief, sauntered out of a side alley near the clock tower entrance. He was no longer wearing the emerald velvet coat. He was in dark, expensive-looking street clothes, but his movements were still theatrical and his anger was palpable. He was holding a small, padded satchel tight to his side, the satchel that likely held the Crimson Eye. Elias knew he had one shot. He followed Kalin discreetly until the mage ducked into a small, inconspicuous hotel a few blocks from the square. Elias waited 5 minutes, then followed him inside. The lobby was empty. Elias approached the reception desk. "I need to speak to the gentleman who just checked in," Elias said, keeping his voice steady. "The one in the dark coat. Tell him the shield of Lyra is here to discuss the Crimson Eye." The receptionist, a nervous young man, stammered, clearly recognizing the description. After a moment, a heavy door beside the desk opened, and Kalin emerged, his face a mask of calculated fury. "The shield of Lyra?" Kalin sneered, his eyes glittering with cold suspicion. "The human who was cowering behind the vampire princess? What insolence allows you to speak my artifact's name? You're lucky I didn't let the trackers fillet you." "I am the reason your auction failed, Kalin," Elias replied, walking straight up to the mage. "And I am the reason the Bone Seeker didn't catch you with the eye. The Night Guard set the whole thing up. They didn't want the eye, they wanted the princess. Now she is captured and being taken to the citadel." Kalin's arrogance flickered, replaced by genuine alarm. "Captured? In the tunnels? That changes the entire calculation. The citadel is impossible to breach. And if the Night Court gets the eye, my head will be next." "Exactly," Elias pressed, playing his only card. "We have a common enemy, Kalin, and a mutual problem. You need the princess for leverage and I need the eye to save her. I have a proposal." Kalin studied Elias, his gaze predatory. "A proposal from a mere human? Speak quickly or I turn you into a coat rack." "The princess is the only one who knows the hidden weaknesses of the citadel's defenses," Elias stated, maintaining fierce eye contact. "The Night Guard will interrogate her. If they drain her for that knowledge, no one can get close. You need her alive and free to draw their attention. I need the Crimson Eye as a bargaining chip." Elias leaned in, dropping his voice to a confidential whisper. "We exchange the eye for Lyra. We use the eye's power to create a massive diversion at the citadel gates, forcing the Night Guard to focus on the artifact. In the chaos, I get Lyra out. You get the eye back and you get a clean escape route far from the reach of the Night Court." Kalin's eyes narrowed, his mind racing through the dangerous proposal. "You want to borrow the most powerful artifact in existence? Why would I trust the survival of my investment to a human who can't even keep himself warm?" "Because you have no other choice," Elias said, coldly decisive. "The citadel is surrounded by etheric traps that only Lyra can identify and disarm. You can't get close without her. I can move in the human world undetected. I was her shield, Kalin. I know how she thinks, I know her vulnerabilities, and I know how to get her out." Kalin took a long, slow breath. He ran a hand through his hair, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. "Very well, human. I will agree to your pathetic arrangement," Kalin finally conceded. "But you will not touch the Crimson Eye. It is far too volatile for your fragile body. I will provide the artifact and I will amplify its power for the diversion, but you will carry the conduit. You will be my vessel, the delivery man for the chaos." Kalin opened the satchel and pulled out an object far smaller than the eye, a necklace made of polished, black obsidian, carved with strange, swirling patterns. "This is a focal conduit," Kalin explained. "It is magically keyed to the Crimson Eye. I will place the eye's power signature into this necklace. When you enter the citadel, you wear this. The moment I activate the eye's full power, the energy will channel through the necklace, turning you into a temporary, controlled etheric bomb. It will draw every tracker in the citadel to your position. Elias looked at the necklace, then at the man offering it. He was trading his life for a single chance at Lyra's freedom. And what guarantees do I have that you won't leave me stranded once Lyra is free? Elias challenged. My word is my bond, human, Kalin sneered, but then his expression turned serious. No. My guarantee is that if you fail, the eye falls into the hands of the Night Court, and my death is assured. We need each other to survive. Meet me here at midnight. Be ready to become a walking beacon of doom, shield of Lyra. Kalin turned and vanished back behind the heavy door, leaving Elias standing alone in the quiet lobby, holding the black obsidian necklace, his new lethal tether to the vampire princess. The obsidian necklace felt unnaturally cold against Elias's skin, a constant reminder of the chilling bargain he'd struck with Kalin. He spent the remainder of the day in an internet cafe near the main square, his mind racing through the citadel schematics. The fortress, perched high on the hill, was a perfect medieval trap, thick walls, limited entrances and commanding views of the city. For a human, it was daunting. For a captured vampire princess, it was a tomb. He knew Lyra would be held in the deepest dungeon, likely restrained by silver chains and subjected to the withering process to break her will and extract the knowledge of the citadel's etheric defenses. He couldn't go in blind. He needed Lyra to know the plan. Elias had a dangerous idea, one born from their forced intimacy. Lyra had taught him that her species, the Night Court, could sense subtle fluctuations in etheric energy. The focal conduit around his neck was designed to channel a massive blast, but Elias wondered if he could use the smaller ambient trace of energy in the necklace for a more delicate purpose. He found a secluded corner in the cafe, shielded by a tall potted plant. He focused on the necklace, closing his eyes and remembering the exact physical pressure and cadence of Lyra's heart against his chest, the rhythmic pulsing of her bindings. He tried to send a thought. Not a spoken message, but a pure, concentrated burst of feeling and information directed toward the citadel. He envisioned the map of the tunnels beneath Goldsmith's Alley, the route he had taken to escape, and the single small maintenance hatch Lyra had pointed out as a possible secondary exit. He poured all his remaining emotional energy, the warmth, the fear, the desperation of their shared survival, into the black stone. He focused on a single coded instruction: maintenance hatch. Midnight. Don't fight them. Wait. He continued the exercise for 10 minutes, until the obsidian felt faintly warm, a sign that a minuscule amount of latent ether had flowed through it. He hoped Lyra, even in her weakened state, would recognize the unique resonance of the man who had been her heat shield. Elias met Kalin back at the hotel precisely at 11 o'clock. Kalin was perched on the edge of the bed, the Crimson Eye resting on a stack of silk scarves, pulsating with a hypnotizing internal red light. Your face is pale, human, Kalin observed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Afraid of being atomized? You should be. I did what you asked, Elias stated, ignoring the taunt. Now, I need to know the mechanics of the diversion. How do I survive the explosion you're planning? Kalin chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. You don't. You will be at the epicenter. But the focus of the blast will be upward. I will remotely trigger the eye from a distance. The power channeled through your conduit will breach the citadel's main gate and create a massive, concentrated column of ether that will draw every night guard from the dungeon to the walls. What's my time window? The surge will last exactly 60 seconds, Kalin informed him, his eyes cold and technical. After the surge, the conduit will explode, taking you with it. But in those 60 seconds, the night guard will be completely paralyzed by the noise and the power. That is your window to find the princess and escape. Elias swallowed the knot in his throat. 60 seconds. That was his entire lifespan. Activate the conduit, Elias ordered. I need to know I can walk through the citadel without incinerating myself before the main blast. Kalin raised an eyebrow, impressed by the human's courage. He took a heavy ornate silver ring from his finger. This is the attunement key, he explained. It allows me to remotely push a minimal non-lethal pulse through the necklace. Kalin pressed the ring, and Elias felt a sudden electrical shiver run through the obsidian. The necklace didn't glow, but Elias felt his entire body suddenly radiate heat, not the comforting warmth of Lyra but a sharp, unnatural fever. This is the tracking pulse, Kalin said. Every tracker will feel this. You are a walking low-grade beacon. They will know you are a threat but not the scale of the threat. Good, Elias said, adjusting his hood. Now let's go free a vampire princess. Kalin packed the Crimson Eye carefully and led Elias out of the hotel. They drove a stolen black car up the winding, dark road to the Citadel Hill. They stopped at a secluded spot overlooking the fortress. The citadel was dark, silent, and formidable, a massive ancient stone beast. I will take the 2 kilometers in the opposite direction, Kalin explained, setting up a tripod and a strange array of polished mirrors. You will scale the outer wall. Use the maintenance route. Get to the main gate's internal controls. When you are ready, send me a final pulse with the conduit. Then the clock starts. Elias nodded, his heart hammering the rhythm of the life he was about to risk. He started the climb. The old stone was slick with moss and cold dew. He used every ounce of his athleticism, driven only by the terrifying focused heat that the obsidian necklace was pushing through his veins. He reached the top of the wall, finding a discreet access door into the fortifications. He was inside the citadel. He moved through the inner courtyard like a ghost, following the schematics he'd memorized. The air was cold, sterile, and heavy with the oppressive magic of the night guard. He found the main gate controls, a small, fortified room near the main portcullis. He keyed the final message into the necklace, focusing his mind on Kalin's distant position. Ready. He felt a deep, wrenching finality as he let go. The power was in Kalin's hands now. He knew Lyra was somewhere deep below. He had only a minute of chaos. He had to be fast. He took a final look at the gate controls, then turned and plunged into the network of dark stairwells leading down to the dungeons. Suddenly, a massive, deafening boom tore through the silence of the citadel. The ground beneath Elias's feet shook violently, the ancient stone walls groaning in protest. The air ignited in a brilliant, terrifying pillar of crimson light that rose high above the fortress. Kalin had triggered the Crimson Eye. Elias's body surged with an unbearable, electric heat. The conduit was channeling the eye's catastrophic power through him. He was a walking sun, a targeted beacon of etheric fury. He heard the cries of the night guard, the thunder of armored feet, all rushing frantically toward the main gate. The plan was working. He had 60 seconds. He crashed through the dungeon door, the heat radiating from him so intensely that the air around him crackled. He saw a line of cells, and in the last one, restrained by heavy silver chains, was Lyra. She was pale, weak, and cold, but her silver eyes were open, fixed on him. She saw the fiery obsidian around his neck, the source of the inferno. She saw the deadly purpose in his eyes. And she nodded, acknowledging the message he had sent. Maintenance hatch. Wait. Elias ran to her cell, the ticking clock of the conduit's imminent explosion deafening everything. The dungeons reeked of stale stone, despair, and now the metallic tang of superheated air. Elias stood before Lyra's cell, the focal conduit around his neck thrumming like a captive sun. The crimson light from the main gate explosion was still faintly visible through the tiny dungeon window, illuminating the scene in shades of red and black. Elias, Lyra rasped, her voice thin, her silver eyes dark with pain. She was bound to the wall by heavy ornate silver chains, a metal poisonous to her species, that were drawing the last of her ether. Her once luminous skin was pallid, and the silver bindings on her arms were completely black and inert. I got your message, she affirmed, a ghost of her former regal self. The maintenance hatch. But the door to this cell is reinforced steel and the lock is blood-keyed. You don't have time. Elias knew the seconds were slipping away. He could feel the conduit overheating, the obsidian burning his neck. He had less than 30 seconds before Kalin's remote trigger caused the necklace to detonate. I don't need the lock, Lyra. I need the chains, Elias said, his mind moving with frantic precision. He grabbed the nearest chair, a heavy iron stool used by the guards, and hurled it with all his strength against the thickest link of the silver chain binding her left wrist. The stool bent, but the chain held, vibrating with the impact. Silver is stronger than steel to us, Lyra managed, watching him with unnerving calm. They're enchanted. You cannot break them with brute force, human. But magic can, Elias countered, seizing the advantage of his new temporary power. He stepped closer to the bars, the heat radiating from him intense enough to make the metal sizzle. He pressed his palms directly against the thick, ornate silver lock on the cell door. The conduit responded instantly. The concentrated etheric energy, meant for destruction, flowed through the silver. The silver, being magically hostile to night court ether, reacted violently. The lock didn't melt, but it shattered, a brilliant flash of molten, poisonous metal exploding outward. The force threw Elias back against the wall. He hit the stone with a sickening thump, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. But the cell door, its lock destroyed, swung open. Elias stumbled inside, grabbing Lyra's frozen, exposed body. She was icy to the touch, the withering far advanced. He pulled her free from the wall, forcing her to lean heavily against his side. The chains on your wrists, Elias grunted, pulling out a small steel knife he'd bought in the market. They're just thick silver. I can use the conduit again, but it'll take too much time and I'll attract the bone seeker. No time, Lyra breathed, her head resting against his shoulder, her body greedily absorbing the conduit's heat, the terrifying life-giving heat. Listen, Elias. The maintenance hatch is blocked by a stone golem, a permanent guardian. We must pass through the main armory. It's the only way. Armory? That's where they'll come back to. It's also where they keep the shadowweave blades, Lyra hissed, pushing his body heat into her core. Their steel is key to my magic. Use the conduit on one of those blades. It will overload its etheric capacity and create a temporary portal to the hidden tunnels. It's a trick only the Royal Guard knows. Elias looked at her, her face drawn, her strength gone, yet her mind sharp and tactical. She was directing their escape even while barely alive. He looked down at his neck. The obsidian was now smoking, visibly cracking under the strain. Less than 10 seconds. Armory, Elias confirmed. He practically dragged the princess, supporting her weight with one arm, his free hand constantly on the conduit, keeping the energy stable. They stumbled down the dark corridor. Just as they reached the massive oak door of the armory, a figure rounded the corner at lightning speed. It was the Bone Seeker. He was back, having realized the explosion was a diversion, not an attack. He saw Elias, the human who smelled of the princess and was now glowing with the power of the eye, and he saw Lyra, weak and exposed. You will not escape, human. The Bone Seeker roared, raising his skull staff, which cracked with dark, lethal energy. Lyra, the armory door. Elias yelled, kicking the heavy door open and shoving Lyra inside. Elias was left alone in the corridor, directly facing the enraged tracker. He didn't have time to fight. He pressed his hands against the wall, channeling the last concentrated heat of the conduit. The obsidian around his neck shattered with a violent crack, sending 1,000 degrees of lethal heat into the stone. The conduit was spent. But the focused blast created a blinding, localized shield of thermal energy that staggered the Bone Seeker, buying Elias a single crucial second. He sprinted into the armory, slamming the heavy door shut behind him. He was alive, but the conduit was destroyed, the 60-second window had closed, and he was back to being a freezing human, trapped with a dying vampire princess, now facing an impossible escape. The instant Elias slammed the heavy oak door of the armory shut, the Bone Seeker hit the outside with a tremendous, armored shoulder. The ancient wood groaned, but held. Elias dragged Lyra further into the room. The armory was a chaotic repository of weapons, gleaming racks of swords, crossbows and stacked shields. The air was cold, laced with the metallic tang of iron and the residual, oppressive ether of the night court. Lyra, leaning heavily against him, was shivering violently. Without the conduit, his own body heat was a feeble defense against the rapid advance of the withering. The blades, Elias. Lyra choked out, pointing with a shaky hand toward a locked, glass case in the center of the room. The shadowweave blades. The long ones with the spiral hilts. Elias looked at the case. It was secured by a heavy, traditional steel padlock. He had no magical explosive now, only his freezing hands and a steel knife. The lock is steel, not silver, Elias panted, grabbing a heavy ceremonial mace from the wall. But it's too thick. Not the lock. Lyra whispered urgently, her eyes closed, conserving every flicker of energy. The glass. It is normal, fragile glass. The night guard relies on the magical traps, not the mundane locks. The Bone Seeker roared outside, followed by a sickening crack as his skull staff slammed against the door, weakening the frame. Elias had seconds. He swung the mace with desperate force against the glass case. The glass shattered instantly, exploding inward. Elias lunged, grabbing two of the shadowweave blades, long, curved sabers with hilts carved into swirling patterns. What now, Lyra? Elias demanded, holding her up with one shoulder. The door began to splinter under the relentless assault outside. The blades are attuned to the deepest pathways of the citadel's etheric flow, Lyra explained, barely able to speak. They must be crossed, tip to hilt, to create a localized flux. The power surge from Kalin's initial blast is still vibrating in the stone. That resonance will power the portal. Elias quickly placed the two blades hilt to tip on the cold stone floor, forming a perfect X. As soon as the metals touched, the blades began to vibrate with a low, intense hum. The point where they crossed started to shimmer, turning the cold stone a deep, shimmering blue, a gateway. Get ready to jump, Elias urged, pulling Lyra toward the shimmering spot. The armory door burst inward with a tremendous crash. Splinters flew everywhere. Standing in the broken frame, illuminated by the fading crimson light, was the Bone Seeker. His armor was scuffed from the explosion, and his eyes were burning with cold, pure hatred. He spotted Lyra and Elias by the portal and let out a triumphant roar. "You will not flee, princess. You will die on the stone." The Bone Seeker lunged forward, his silver-tipped skull staff raised high, aimed directly at Lyra's head. Elias reacted on instinct. He let go of Lyra, allowing her frail body to collapse toward the blue light of the portal, and spun around to intercept the attack. He grabbed a heavy wooden shield and slammed it against the Bone Seeker's massive staff. The force of the impact was devastating. The shield cracked and disintegrated, and the staff glanced off Elias's shoulder. Pain flared, blinding and intense. He was thrown backward, skidding across the stone floor, his arm already numb. But he had bought them the necessary seconds. "Elias, get in!" Lyra screamed, already half submerged in the shimmering blue light of the nascent portal. Elias scrambled back to his feet. The Bone Seeker was recovering, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the portal, savoring the kill. "You are just a human shield." The Bone Seeker sneered, his voice chilling. "You are useless without her magic." Elias didn't waste time talking. He grabbed the only thing he could reach, the heavy splintered mace he had used to smash the glass, and threw it with a final desperate burst of strength, hitting the Bone Seeker squarely in the chest plate. The mace bounced off, but the distraction was enough. Elias leaped. He plunged through the cool, shimmering blue light, landing hard on top of Lyra, who was now fully on the other side. The air instantly changed. It was cold, damp, and smelled of the same pine and frozen earth from the mountains. They were in the hidden tunnel network beneath the city. The portal snapped shut behind them with a sharp, echoing crack, severing the crossed blades. We made it," Elias gasped, collapsing onto the hard ground, every muscle screaming in protest. Lyra didn't reply immediately. She was lying beneath him, her body completely rigid, her skin deathly pale. The withering was at its peak. She was alive, but only barely. "The heat, Elias," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "My bindings are destroyed. I am dying. You must tether me. Now or we both perish in this cold." Elias, despite the paralyzing pain in his shoulder and the shock of their escape, understood the absolute urgency. He reached for the only thing they had left, the heavy expedition-grade sleeping bag he had left in the auction chamber. He realized then what Lyra had been doing when she pushed him out. She hadn't left the sleeping bag as a decoy. She had thrown it into the tunnels, knowing he would need it to complete the escape. Kalin's explosion had blasted the bag back toward the chamber, but it must have been shielded by the stone golem. He felt around the dark floor. His fingers brushed against a familiar heavy nylon. He had it. Elias ripped open the bag and, with a last surge of desperate strength, hauled Lyra's frozen body fully inside, following immediately. He wrapped his arms and legs around her, pressing his entire core to her, sealing them both inside the thick material. It wasn't affection. It was a brutal, primal act of survival. Slowly, agonizingly, the extreme cold radiating from Lyra receded, replaced by the faint, blessed warmth of his own body. Lyra let out a deep, shuddering sigh, and her grip, the grip of the vampire princess, tightened around his waist. This time, the embrace was not just for survival, but a silent acknowledgement of their complete, irreversible dependence. They were free of the citadel, but they were trapped in the tunnels, and they still didn't have the Crimson Eye. The dark tunnel was silent, save for the shallow, rhythmic sounds of two people desperately clinging to life. Elias and Lyra remained locked in the thick, insulated cocoon of the sleeping bag for what felt like endless hours. Elias's injured shoulder throbbed with a dull, excruciating ache, but the focused, desperate warmth of Lyra's body pressed against his own was a more urgent sensation. He felt the terrifying cold of the withering slowly receding, replaced by a slow, agonizing return to her normal, supernatural warmth. Lyra was healing, but the process was draining him completely. His head swam with exhaustion, and his own core temperature felt dangerously low. "Elias," Lyra finally whispered, her voice regaining its low melodic quality, though still brittle with exhaustion. Her eyes fluttered open, the silver now faint but steady. "We are safe for the moment. The portal will have sent the Bone Seeker's men into a frenzy, but the tunnel network is vast. They cannot track us here." "Good," Elias managed, his voice hoarse. "You're alive. Your bindings?" Lyra looked down at her forearm. The intricate silver runes were still black, but she could now see a faint, almost invisible golden shimmer at the edges. "They are destroyed but not inert." The sheer proximity to your human heat has started a spontaneous, crude repair. It will take days to stabilize, and I will be utterly dependent on you until then. She tightened her arms around him, a gesture now rooted less in threat and more in fundamental necessity. We need to get out of these tunnels, Elias said. The Bone Seeker knows this network exists. We need to reach the surface and find a place to hide. And we need to find out what Kalin did. Lyra used her remaining strength to pull a small metal map cylinder from an inner pocket of her ruined cloak. This tunnel leads to the main catacomb drain. It opens into the city's old sewage system, near the train yard. It's disgusting, but it's our cleanest exit. We need to move now while the night guard is still preoccupied with the citadel. They exited the sleeping bag, a brief, cold, necessary separation. Lyra was weak but stable enough to walk, leaning heavily on Elias. His injured shoulder screamed a protest, but he endured the pain, his focus entirely on getting her to safety. The journey through the foul, dripping tunnels was a nightmare of filth and desperation. They finally found the heavy rusted grate leading to the train yard, a high-traffic area, perfect for blending in. As they emerged into the pre-dawn gloom, a figure was waiting for them, leaning against the cold metal of a boxcar. It was Kalin. The rogue mage, still impeccably dressed, had a weary, triumphant look on his face. He was casually tossing a familiar object in his hand. It was the Crimson Eye of Aethelred. I knew the shield of Lyra would come this way, Kalin greeted them, his voice echoing in the vast, empty yard. A predictable exit for the desperate. Elias instinctively shielded Lyra. You betrayed us, Kalin. You set off the explosion and left us to die. Kalin laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Betrayal? Elias, I upheld my end of the bargain. My deal was to provide a diversion and a window of escape, not to hold your hand through the silver chains. I created the chaos, the best I could do. I even disabled the Bone Seeker's internal communications briefly after the blast. He held up the Crimson Eye. While the night guard was busy with your theatrical entrance, I quietly slipped back into the chamber, used the sustained power of the eye to eliminate the few remaining bidders who tried to stop me and collected my prize. The mission was a success, thanks to your sacrifice. The mission was to stop the eye from falling into your hands. Lyra countered, her voice ringing with fragile authority. Oh, Princess, you wound me, Kalin said, walking closer. But I have a proposition. The citadel is locked down. The entire city is crawling with your uncle's guard. You are weak and your bindings are failing. You need a safe, magically shielded extraction point. He stopped a few feet away, holding the massive, throbbing ruby between two fingers. I need to sell this artifact and the human world is too hot. I have a buyer waiting in Vienna, a powerful neutral party, the Arch Duchess of the Eastern Fae. She will pay a high price and her territory is safe from the night court. Kalin's expression became utterly serious. I will grant you passage to Vienna and access to the Arch Duchess. You will argue your case to her, explain why she should not buy the eye from me, but instead return it to the night court. If you convince her, you get your eye back and your kingdom is saved. If you fail, I get my wealth and your uncle loses his prize. You want me to risk my life on a diplomatic mission in an enemy's court? Lyra challenged. No, Princess. I want you to give me a guarantee, Kalin smirked. You need to convince the Archduchess that the eye is too dangerous to buy. And you need the human. The moment he is separated from you, you are a dead woman walking. You are his key to life and he is your source of survival. You will remain tethered to the human for the entirety of the journey, until we reach Vienna. He is the collateral. Lyra looked at the terrifying eye, then at Kalin and finally, into the exhausted but determined eyes of Elias. The journey to Vienna is long, Lyra stated. It means continued, permanent reliance on his life force. Indeed, Kalin agreed. Your survival is his insurance. Do we have a deal, Princess? Or do I leave you here to be found by the Bone Seeker? Lyra's gaze did not waver from Elias's. She was making a decision that involved the fate of her kingdom and the life of the human tethered to her. We accept, Lyra finally declared, her voice firm. But Elias and I are traveling in the sleeping bag hidden. No separation until we reach the Archduchess. Excellent, Kalin smiled, a wicked triumph in his eyes. Welcome to the Grand Tour, Princess. We leave for Vienna in 1 hour. Kalin provided the transportation, a sleek, black, nondescript sedan, stolen, Elias rightly assumed. The interior was cramped, especially for 3 people, one of whom was perpetually wrapped around another. Lyra and Elias were forced into the back seat. Lyra insisted on their survival tether. They were both sealed inside the heavy sleeping bag, maintaining the full, crushing intimacy of their forced bond. Lyra was the driver of their survival and Elias was the engine. "This is ridiculous," Kalin muttered, glancing in the rearview mirror as he navigated the morning traffic out of Brasov. He had the Crimson Eye secured in a small, magically warded box on the passenger seat. A vampire princess and her human furnace wrapped up like a morbid sausage roll. "Try to look like tourists, not runaways. Our survival is non-negotiable, thief." Lyra's muffled voice came from the depths of the bag. Her breathing was steady now, her recovery progressing slowly but surely. "And your precious eye is safe only as long as I remain stable and can access my residual power. Which means no separation." Elias, wedged against the window, felt the familiar mix of resignation and discomfort. The heat inside the bag was suffocating, and the constant physical contact left him utterly exhausted. Yet every minute without the tether he knew would be fatal for Lyra. The journey began in tense silence. Kalin drove with a focused intensity, navigating the network of highways and backroads leading toward the Hungarian border. Elias spent his time doing Lyra's bidding, checking his phone for news reports about the citadel siege, which were strangely absent, suggesting a high-level cover-up, and tracking the route. "We need to bypass the main checkpoints," Lyra instructed, her hand resting on Elias's chest, directly over his heart. "The Night Guard will have magical sensors at every official border crossing, key to my lineage's etheric signature. They will also be looking for Kalin's known escape routes." "My routes are far too sophisticated for your simple family assassins," Princess Kalin scoffed. "Your arrogance is a liability," Lyra shot back. "The Bone Seeker is not simple. He tracked us in the tunnels and he will track your known magical movements. We must use human inefficiency as a shield." Elias interceded, pointing at a map on his phone. "There's an old, poorly maintained mountain pass near Aradia. It's primarily used by local farmers and smugglers. It's slow but low-tech. No magical sensors, just customs officers looking for cigarettes." Kalin grumbled but agreed. The detour added hours to their journey, pushing them into the late afternoon before they reached the obscure pass. As they drove through the dense, forested mountains, the tension in the car ratcheted up. Lyra tensed beneath the nylon shell of the sleeping bag. "Stop the car, Kalin," she commanded sharply. "What?" "I feel it," Lyra hissed. "The scent of shadow dust. A magical tracking element. It's faint but distinct. We've been followed, thief." Kalin swore violently and slammed on the brakes, pulling the car abruptly off the road into the shelter of thick pine trees. He grabbed the Crimson Eye box and flung open the driver's door. "The Bone Seeker's pet assassins are here," Kalin realized, his voice edged with panic. "They tracked my residual magic just as you warned. We have to run." "No. They will catch us if we run," Lyra instructed, her voice regaining a steeliness that belied her weak state. "They are not here for the eye, Kalin. They are here for me. If they take me, they win the war against my mother. We must turn the tables. Elias, get out of the sleeping bag." Elias obeyed, peeling himself away from Lyra's desperate warmth. He felt the cold immediately, but Lyra's recovery had gifted him enough residual heat to function for a few minutes. Lyra, weakened but stable, remained in the back seat, using the car as cover. "Take this, Elias," Lyra said, pressing something cool and hard into his hand. It was a single, perfect silver scale from her folded wing. "It is infused with a minuscule amount of my blood ether. It will act as a concentrated lure. They will lock onto this, believing it is a piece of the destroyed bindings." "What's the plan?" Elias asked, clutching the silver scale. "Kalin," Lyra called out. "You are a mage. Create a simple illusion, a shimmering thermal outline of a lone woman running away from the car, carrying the eye. The shadow dust trackers are precise, but they are also single-minded. They will chase the illusion." Kalin, seeing the logic in the princess's desperate plan, began to chant under his breath, drawing a swirling vortex of shimmering heat and light just a few meters from the car. The illusion was flawless, a perfect thermal copy of Lyra running into the depths of the forest, the red pulse of the Crimson Eye visible in its illusory hand. "Elias," Lyra commanded, her silver eyes fixed on him. "You are the anchor. Run in the opposite direction toward the cliff edge. Throw the scale off the edge toward the valley and then run back to me. The combined lure of the illusion and the scale will scatter the trackers. We get back on the road and drive until we hit Vienna." Elias knew the risk. He was exposing himself, drawing the attention of the assassins. But he was Lyra's only functional soldier. He nodded, the adrenaline replacing the exhaustion. He bolted away from the car, running towards the sheer drop of the cliff edge, the tiny silver scale burning in his hand. The instant he reached the cliff, he heard the first sound of pursuit, a silent, deadly swoosh as a figure descended from the high trees, followed by another. Two of the night guard, masked and silent, had locked onto the heat signature of the scale. They ignored the shimmering illusion and bore down on Elias. Elias hurled the silver scale into the dizzying void of the valley. It caught the wind, flashing a signal like a tiny star, and was instantly lost to the depths. Now he was the target. The two trackers, realizing the scale was merely a lure, pivoted instantly, their silver blades drawn, closing the distance to the human shield. Kalin. Now. Lyra screamed from the car. Kalin, finished with his illusion, snapped his fingers. The illusory Lyra vanished. The two trackers, momentarily confused and surrounded by conflicting thermal and magical lures, hesitated. Elias used the moment. He turned and sprinted back towards the safety of the car, the blades of the night guard assassins mere inches from his back. Elias scrambled back into the car, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the nylon shell of the sleeping bag, where Lyra was waiting. He fell against her, his exhausted body instantly seeking the familiar, stabilizing warmth. Kalin didn't wait. He slammed the car into drive and accelerated violently, spinning gravel as he shot back onto the mountain road. Did they follow? Kalin barked, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. Lyra, still muffled by the thick bag, pressed her cool hand against Elias's exposed skin, tracing the faint outline of the wound on his shoulder. No. Your illusion was crude, thief, but effective. The combination of the false thermal signature and the falling ether scale scent will divide their pursuit for hours. We have a clear window, but it is closing fast. Drive without stopping, Kalin. The next few hours were a blur of motion, paranoia, and oppressive heat. Elias and Lyra remained locked together in the back seat, a constant, heavy weight of mutual necessity. The cold from the outside world became a distant threat, replaced by the internal humidity of their shared cocoon. Elias had been terrified for Lyra, but now, with the danger momentarily past, a new, more confusing set of emotions settled over him. When he was running from the trackers, his primary drive wasn't survival, it was the absolute, unthinking need to return to her, to ensure her safety. He was no longer just her shield, he was irrevocably invested in her. Lyra's hand remained on his chest, her fingers occasionally brushing the fabric covering his heart. She wasn't just drawing heat, she was monitoring his vitals, ensuring her power source remained functional. But in the rhythmic pulse of his heart against her palm, Elias felt a silent, unspoken communion. The bone seeker is not a fool, Elias, Lyra said quietly, her breath warm against his ear. He will find the truth quickly. Our only remaining defense is the border crossing. We must cross into Hungary before dawn. Elias checked the GPS. The main road to the border was heavily monitored, likely already flagged with Kalin's and Lyra's magical traces. We need a trick, Elias said, his mind churning, refusing to be passive. We need to look so mundane, so boring that the border guards don't even bother to scan the car. Mundane is your specialty, Kalin scoffed from the front. My magical signature is far too potent to ignore at a border post. Then we separate your signature from the car, Lyra instructed, her eyes opening slightly, a brilliant, terrifying silver in the darkness. Elias, what is the most common way for a human to cross that border without a car, and without attracting magical attention? The train, Elias realized. They rarely run magical scans on passenger trains, focusing mostly on cargo. And it's a distraction. They hatched a new, risky plan as the sun began to rise. Kalin would drive the car, drawing the initial attention to the main car crossing checkpoint a few miles south. Meanwhile, Elias and Lyra would be dropped off at a secluded station on the Romanian side and board the first international train, relying on the sheer inefficiency of human bureaucracy and their unnatural disguise. If I leave the car, I have to leave the eye, Kalin stated, his voice laced with suspicion. I am not leaving my prize unguarded. You will carry the eye on the train with us, Lyra decided, her tone final. You are our magical defense, Kalin. The eye will amplify your shielding spells. We are safest together. And this is your guarantee. If you separate from us, the Bone Seeker will find you first. Kalin grudgingly agreed, recognizing the desperate truth of her threat. They stopped at a tiny, deserted train station, just as a slow, rattling train pulled into the platform. Elias and Lyra quickly separated from the sleeping bag, a quick, cold break, and pulled their jackets tight. Lyra used the brief moment to adjust her disguise, pulling the hood lower and trying to affect the look of a tired, withdrawn traveler. They boarded the train, Elias supporting Lyra's weight as if she were a recovering patient. Kalin followed, the magically warded box containing the Crimson Eye tucked into a plain backpack. They found a compartment near the end of the train, seating themselves in the far corner. Lyra immediately leaned into Elias, seeking the vital necessary contact, but maintaining the outward appearance of a couple simply exhausted from travel. As the train rattled toward the border, Elias looked at Lyra. Her face was pale, but the extreme fear of the withering had been replaced by a quiet, consuming focus. She was no longer just the princess, she was a wounded strategist relying completely on him. He gently reached out, not to draw her closer, but to push a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was an involuntary, tender gesture, a realization that the lines between necessary survival and genuine care had blurred beyond recognition. Lyra's silver eyes widened slightly at the unexpected intimacy. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath warming his ear. "You risked your life for my freedom, Elias Vance," she murmured, her voice almost a sigh. "I had resigned myself to being captured. You are not what I expected of a human. You are not what I expected of a vampire princess," Elias whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "You are cold, but you are also fire. You are terrifying, but you trust me with your life." Just then the train slowed dramatically, shuddering to a halt at a long, concrete platform. Outside the window, a large sign marked the Romanian-Hungarian border. The compartment door slid open, and a bored-looking customs officer stepped in, followed closely by a sharp-eyed border policeman who scanned the compartment with a small, handheld metal detector. Kalin froze, gripping his backpack tightly. Lyra pressed close to Elias, tensed, preparing for the inevitable interrogation. Elias squeezed her hand beneath his coat, projecting calm. The customs officer paused at their compartment, his eyes lingering on the strangely intimate pair, before glancing dismissively at Kalin. "Passports, please," the officer requested, his tone indifferent. Elias presented his passport. Kalin fumbled for his papers. Lyra, however, could not risk exposing her night court identification. Elias took a deep breath, executing a diversion he hadn't planned, only improvised. He quickly reached over, pulled Lyra's hooded head to his shoulder, and spoke to the officer in a low, exhausted tone. "Sorry, officer. My wife is sick. She was in a skiing accident in the Carpathians, minor head trauma. We need to get her to a specialist in Vienna immediately. Please be quick." Lyra, understanding instantly, closed her eyes and went limp against him, simulating severe exhaustion and pain. The border guard, seeing this sick, traumatized wife, and the distressed husband, and finding no magical anomalies with his basic scanner, waved them on with a quick gesture. "Just the passports for the sick traveler." Then the officer sighed, stamping the documents with weary speed. "Next time take the plane." The door slid shut. They were safe. The human element had worked perfectly. Lyra waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before lifting her head. She looked at Elias, her silver eyes filled with a gratitude that transcended mere words. "My wife," Lyra repeated softly, the term sounding utterly foreign yet possessive on her tongue. "A clever ruse, Elias Vance. You are an adept liar." "Only when necessary," Elias replied, the blush returning to his cheeks. He still felt the phantom warmth of her simulating a head injury against his own. "We are in Hungary now, Lyra. One step closer to Vienna. One step closer to the Arch Duchess." But they were also one step closer to the final separation, and neither of them mentioned it. The train compartment, rocking steadily through the Hungarian plains, was a crucible of tension. Elias and Lyra remained outwardly posed as a tired, intimate couple, but the shared sleeping bag beneath their coats felt less like a necessity and more like a permanent, invisible extension of their bodies. Kalin sat across from them, reading a foreign newspaper, but his eyes constantly flickered toward the magically warded box containing the Crimson Eye in his lap. Lyra's recovery was noticeable. Her pallor was gone, replaced by the faint, almost translucent glow of her natural complexion. The bindings on her forearm, though still scarred and dark, now held a definite, stable golden shimmer, a clear sign that Elias's heat had successfully stabilized the damage. Her reliance on him was still absolute, but her strength was returning. "Vienna is close," Lyra whispered against Elias's collarbone, her eyes narrowed in contemplation. "But the closer we get to the Arch Duchess, the more dangerous Kalin becomes." "What?" Elias asked quietly, trying not to disturb the sleeping bag. "He needs us to reach the Arch Duchess. He won't try anything before the sale." "He will," Lyra corrected, her voice low and grave. "Kalin is not a fool. He knows the Arch Duchess is neutral, but she is also a judge of magical power. If he walks in with the eye and I stand beside him, clearly recovered and radiating a stabilized etheric signature, The Archduchess will recognize the eye's true power, and his weakness. His weakness. He can't wield it, Lyra explained. The Crimson Eye requires royal blood to be wielded effectively. Kalin, the rogue mage, can only use its power for simple amplification and shielding. If the Archduchess realizes Kalin can't unlock the eye's full potential, she will simply seize it. Kalin is not risking his profit on the Archduchess's mercy. A terrible realization dawned on Elias. He needs to prove the eye is worth buying. He needs a demonstration of its power, and he needs to eliminate the threat of you contradicting him. Exactly, Lyra confirmed. And for the Archduchess to accept his claim, I must be silent. Or better yet, dead. He needs to ensure my fate before we set foot in her court. Elias felt a chill despite the stifling heat of the sleeping bag. He was the only thing preventing Kalin from killing Lyra right now. The tether was their only bargaining chip. I have an idea, Elias said, his mind shifting into defense mode. You are recovering. Your bindings are stable. We need to find a weakness in Kalin's control of the eye. He keeps it in that warded box, Lyra sighed, nodding towards Kalin's lap. He rarely lets it out of his sight. The box is sealed by a complex etheric cipher that only he knows. But Kalin is relying on the eye for all his power, Elias pointed out, remembering the way the mage used the artifact for the conduit. If we overload his concentration even for a moment, he might slip up. Elias looked at Kalin, then at the compartment door. They were moving at high speed, completely isolated. We need a distraction, Elias suggested. A big one. And it needs to be physical, not magical. Something that forces Kalin to divert his focus completely from his cipher and the eye. As Elias spoke, he felt a strange new sensation from Lyra. Instead of simply absorbing his heat, Lyra's fingers, resting on his bare chest beneath the layers of clothing, were moving. Not drawing heat, but tracing a pattern. A slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the distant rhythmic clatter of the train tracks. It was the same rhythm she used when channeling energy. She is communicating. Lyra shifted slightly, pulling his hand deeper inside the sleeping bag, pressing his palm flat against her recovered bindings. He felt the slight, steady thrumming of the golden shimmer. The distraction must come from the outside, Lyra communicated softly through her movements, her silver eyes fixed on Kalin. And it must be something the night guard would do. A high-speed pursuit on the train. Kalin is paranoid about them. That is his greatest weakness. Elias understood. They couldn't conjure an explosion, but they could simulate one. Kalin, Elias called out, raising his voice slightly to penetrate the sound of the train. I just saw something out the window. Kalin lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowed. What human? A faint, blue light flash in the fields, Elias said, making his voice sound strained and panicked. It was low to the ground. It looked exactly like the light you used to activate the thermal illusion near the cliff. A tracker is trying to match your speed. Kalin froze. His calm, arrogant posture instantly shattered. The idea of the Bone Seeker matching his speed and coming for the eye terrified him more than Lyra's recovered power. He snatched his magical backpack and lunged toward the window, desperately scanning the passing fields for any sign of a magical tail. Impossible. I shielded the car. No one could have tracked us this far. Kalin stammered, pulling out a small, crystal focus, preparing a counterspell. This was their moment. Lyra didn't need to attack Kalin. She needed to attack the cipher. Lyra quickly pulled a single ornamental hairpin from her braid, a thin, silver spike. With a speed that belied her weakness, she pressed the point of the spike against the warded box in Kalin's seat. As Kalin was completely focused on the outside threat, Lyra channeled the newly stabilized pulsing golden ether from her bindings, through Elias and into the silver spike. The silver spike, hostile to the magic, served as a conduit, creating a tiny, intense feedback loop. The spike didn't break the cipher. It merely disrupted it, creating a brief, localized electrical surge that overloaded the wards. A tiny, almost imperceptible hiss came from the box. The metal clasp holding the box shut instantly popped open, weakened by the internal surge. What was that sound? Kalin cried, spinning around from the window, his crystal focus still aimed at the empty fields. I think your wards failed, thief, Lyra stated calmly, her voice filled with quiet triumph. Kalin looked down at the box, now slightly ajar, his face turning ashen. In that single, distracted moment, Lyra had won the first round. The moment we reach Vienna, you are separated from the human, Kalin hissed, his eyes burning with vengeful fury. And you will be delivered to the Archduchess cold and helpless. You will try, thief, Lyra replied, her silver eyes blazing with recovered power. But until then you drive. And Elias and I remain tethered. The train finally hissed to a halt in the grand echoing station of Vienna. The journey was over, but the danger was only beginning. Kalin, his face set in a mask of calculation, quickly herded Lyra and Elias off the platform and into a waiting black sedan. A new, superior model this time. No more theatrics, Princess, Kalin announced, keeping the Crimson Eye box firmly secured beneath his coat. The Arch Duchess of the Eastern Fae is highly selective. We must present ourselves as allies, not escaped criminals. You will be housed in a quiet, magically shielded apartment until the audience tomorrow afternoon. The apartment Kalin drove them to was not a safe house. It was a prison. It was located on the top floor of an old, opulent building overlooking the Danube, luxurious, but entirely sealed. The windows were magically barred, and the entrance was keyed to Kalin's specific etheric signature. Kalin ushered them inside, forcing them to shed the filthy, conspicuous sleeping bag. Lyra, though recovered, instantly clung to Elias, maintaining the critical physical contact. Kalin watched them with cold satisfaction. You will remain tethered to the human, Princess, Kalin stated, waving his hand to activate a series of low-humming magical barriers around the main door. His warmth is the only thing keeping you from collapsing, and he is my insurance. You won't try any teleportation tricks. My wards will crush your ether before you can even summon it. I return tomorrow morning. Be ready to face the Arch Duchess. With that, Kalin slipped out, sealing the door behind him. The lock clicked with a chilling finality, and a dense, oppressive barrier settled over the entrance. Lyra immediately pulled Elias into the most discreet corner of the lavish apartment. She was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the realization of their absolute helplessness. He lied, Lyra hissed, her silver eyes blazing with cold fire. He never intended for me to speak to the Arch Duchess. He will use my dependency as proof of my weakness, arguing that the night court is finished and that the eye is free for sale. We have to get out of here, Elias whispered, running his hands over the smooth, cold stone of the wall, searching for a seam or a weakness. But the windows are barred and Kalin's magic is too strong for us to break the door. We don't need to break the door, Elias. We need to signal, Lyra replied, her strategic mind working at furious speed. Vienna is a key neutral zone. My mother, the Queen, placed a small network of loyalists here, emissaries, spies and hidden acolytes, decades ago. They are dormant, living normal lives, but they are sworn to aid the royal line. Lyra's hand went to the back of her neck, tracing a single, fine scar hidden beneath her hairline. The network is keyed to an archaic form of etheric pulse, a silent hum. I cannot risk sending a full signal. Kalin's wards would intercept it. I must send a residual signal, a faint memory of my lineage's power. How do you send a residual signal without your bindings? Elias asked, knowing her recovery was still too fragile for a full power spell. Lyra looked at Elias, her gaze penetrating. She took his hand and placed it on her inner forearm, where the blackened, damaged runes of the bindings lay. You are my bindings now, Elias, she stated, her voice utterly serious. I need you to channel the energy for me. I will draw the ambient ether from this building into my body, and you will filter and focus it. You will become the tuning fork for my signal. The process was excruciatingly intimate. Lyra pressed her entire body against Elias, demanding perfect, static contact. She closed her eyes and Elias felt a cold, invasive energy seeping into their shared space, the ambient ether of the sealed apartment. As the ether flowed into Lyra, it became warm and sharp. Focus, Elias, Lyra commanded. Think only of the rhythm of the train. The rhythmic pulse we used to communicate. Project that simple, steady cadence into my arm. Elias focused, pouring his will into the strange, humming energy flowing through Lyra. He didn't understand the magic, but he understood the rhythm of their survival. He concentrated on the pulse, thump 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 rest, the signature Lyra had taught him during their journey. Suddenly, the residual ether in Lyra's forearm, where his hand was pressed, flared. It wasn't the powerful crimson or the stabilizing gold, it was a faint, shimmering violet, a color Elias had never seen before. The pulse radiated outward, an invisible rhythmic hum that slipped past Kalin's coarse magical wards. Lyra gasped, pulling away, utterly drained. The violet light was gone, but the signal was sent. It is done, she whispered, her eyes shining with exhaustion. The signal is in the network. If a loyalist is close enough, they will recognize the royal cadence. We wait now. They waited in suffocating silence for what seemed like hours. Just as the sun began to dip below the Viennese skyline, casting the luxurious prison in golden hues, a faint, metallic scratch came from the service vent near the ceiling. A piece of paper, folded into a precise geometric shape, fluttered down onto the Persian rug. Lyra snatched it up, her hands trembling. She unfolded the paper. It was a note written in archaic script and bearing a faint, familiar night court seal. The note was brief and direct. The signal was received, heir. The Bone Seeker has arrived in the city, tracing the magical residue of the citadel blast. Do not attempt to leave the building. We will breach the wards and extract you tonight. Prepare to move fast. The Archduchess's court is the only safe haven. Trust the tether. Lyra looked at Elias, her silver eyes dark with a terrifying mix of relief and renewed dread. The Bone Seeker is here, Lyra stated, her voice tight. Kalin's prison has become our last line of defense. And my loyalists are coming. We have only hours to prepare for a fight that will determine the fate of my kingdom. The Viennese apartment, once a luxurious prison, became a fortress on the eve of the final showdown. Lyra, her eyes reflecting the tension of the city lights, held Elias close. His warmth was the stable core she needed, the foundation for the final, most complex magical operation of her life. They will attack at midnight, Lyra murmured, the scent of the night air sharpening her senses. The night guard is precise. They will breach Kalin's wards the moment the distraction is maximal. What about Kalin? Elias whispered back. He'll be waiting for his buyer. He will be preparing the eye, Lyra stated. He needs to recharge the wards he used for the diversion. He will not anticipate my loyalists attacking his shield. He will be caught completely off guard. At exactly 11:58 p.m., a low, persistent thrum began to vibrate through the walls of the apartment. Not the coarse magic of Kalin, but a refined, controlled etheric power. Lyra's loyalists were at the door. Elias braced himself. Lyra tensed, channeling her now stable golden ether through Elias's body and out into the apartment's architecture, a silent beacon guiding her allies. At 11:59 p.m., Kalin's wards shrieked, a sudden violent sound like tearing metal, and collapsed inward. The door burst open, revealing two figures, a tall, severe woman with eyes like polished amber and a lean, masked man. They were Lyra's loyalists, vampires of the Night Court, dressed in simple modern clothes. Heir of the Night Queen, the woman greeted, bowing low. We are yours to command. The escape route is clear, the rooftops to the Fey embassy. But before Lyra could reply, the apartment's large bay window exploded inward. The Bone Seeker and three of his elite guard launched through the fractured glass, landing in fighting stances. They hadn't followed Lyra's allies, they had anticipated them, using the etheric surge of the Loyalists' attack as a final tracking lock. The escape ends here, Princess. The Bone Seeker roared, his skull staff raised, aimed not at Lyra but at Elias. Sever the tether. The human dies first. Lyra acted instantly. She didn't let go of Elias, she pushed him behind her, pulling her cloak tight. Loyalists, engage the guard. Protect the human. The Loyalists, though outmatched, lunged forward. The apartment descended into immediate chaos, the clang of silver-tipped swords against the Loyalists' etheric shields, and the shattering of furniture. Elias was pulled into the action. The Bone Seeker, bypassing the Loyalists, focused solely on the heat source, Elias. Kalin is still in the building, Lyra yelled to Elias over the melee. He's our only leverage. We need the Crimson Eye. Lyra was weak but no longer helpless. She moved with surprising speed, still clinging to Elias's side. She grabbed a splintered piece of oak from a shattered table and pressed her golden shimmering forearm against it, channeling the energy. The wood didn't catch fire, it shattered into a dozen razor-sharp darts of ether-infused wood, a temporary weapon. She hurled the darts at the Bone Seeker's faceplate, forcing him to block the attack with his staff. Go, Elias. Kalin is in the penthouse study. I will hold them. Lyra commanded, shoving Elias toward the back corridor. Elias didn't hesitate. He ran, the memory of their ultimate trust fueling his speed. He crashed into the study, finding Kalin huddled over a workbench, furiously working with the Crimson Eye. You failed, thief. Elias yelled. The Bone Seeker is here. Your protection failed. Kalin looked up, his face a mixture of fury and shock. My wards held. This is the princess's doing. Get away from the eye. Kalin lunged, but Elias was faster. He snatched the protective box holding the Crimson Eye off the workbench. Kalin screamed in magical fury, hurling a binding spell that hit Elias's shoulder. It didn't physically harm him, but it felt like a concentrated blast of ice, a painful reminder of his lack of defense. Elias, ignoring the burning cold, turned and ran back to the main room. The fight was going badly. One Loyalist was down, and the Bone Seeker had pinned the other, his staff raised for the killing blow. Bone Seeker. Stop. Elias roared, bursting into the room. He held the box high, its thrumming crimson power visible through the cracked wood. I have the eye. Call off your men or I drop it. The Bone Seeker froze. The threat was absolute. If the eye was damaged, the power could detonate, destroying the entire building and everyone in it. Put it down, human. The Bone Seeker hissed, his focus shifting entirely to the artifact. No, Lyra cut in, stepping forward, leaning heavily on Elias for support. Her voice was strong, commanding. The time for war is over. The Arch Duchess of the Eastern Fae has been waiting for us. Bone Seeker, your orders are to retrieve the eye for the Queen, not destroy it. You know the consequence of failure. Kalin, open the way to the Fae embassy. Kalin, seeing the Bone Seeker distracted and the eye held hostage, realized he had lost all leverage. His only chance for a sale was to cooperate. The Fae embassy is 2 blocks away, Kalin conceded, his voice defeated. Their territory is magically sovereign. No night guard can follow. But you must hurry. Kalin raised his hands and fired a precisely targeted spell, blasting a clear hole in the shattered window frame. Lyra, go. Elias urged. We go together, Lyra stated, pulling Elias tight against her side. The Bone Seeker cannot risk following us onto Fae ground, but he will not let us escape. We need a final act of tethering. Lyra reached into the box, her fingers brushing the pulsing ruby. She didn't grab the eye, she grabbed a single energized shard that had broken off the protective casing. She slammed the shard into the Bone Seeker's chest plate, where his ether was most concentrated. The Bone Seeker cried out as the shard discharged its contained energy, creating a blinding, chaotic etheric pulse that completely disrupted his tracking sense. Lyra grabbed Elias, and they launched themselves through the window and onto the adjacent rooftop, leaving Kalin and the paralyzed guard behind. They ran across the rooftops, Elias supporting Lyra's weight, until they reached the low wrought iron fence of the Fae embassy. They were safe. The gate was opened by 2 tall, pale Fae guards. Lyra, leaning on Elias, walked with the posture of a monarch, straight into the ornate Fae court. The Arch Duchess, a stunningly beautiful Fae woman with wings like spun moonlight, sat on a throne carved from white jade. Kalin had arrived moments earlier, panting and disheveled, setting the Crimson Eye on a pedestal. Princess Lyra, the Archduchess greeted, her voice soft but powerful. And your human consort. Kalin tells me you are here to dispute his claim to this artifact. Lyra stepped forward, drawing strength from Elias, who was a solid pillar of heat and support at her side. She spoke not as a captive but as a queen. Your Grace, Lyra began. Kalin sells you the eye, claiming the Night Court is defeated. But look at me. My bindings are broken, yet I stand alive and strong. My Loyalists fought for me. And look at the man at my side. He is human, yet he survived the withering and wielded the eye's power indirectly to save me. Lyra gently laid her hand on Elias's chest. I stand here not through my own magic but through trust and mutual dependence. The Night Court is not defeated, Your Grace. It has simply learned a new strength: collaboration. The eye is not merely a weapon of conquest, it is the cornerstone of a society that is learning to survive through bonds, not just blood. She met the Archduchess's gaze. If you buy the eye from Kalin, you legitimize chaos and the old dark ways of power. If you return it to me, you support a new future, one where the realms can find balance. The tether you see is my proof. My survival is tied to a human's heart. The Archduchess studied Lyra and Elias for a long moment, then looked at Kalin, who stood shivering and desperate. The rogue mage lied, the Archduchess stated calmly. He offered chaos, the princess offers hope. The price of the eye is not gold, Kalin. It is power, and you have none. She waved her hand. The Crimson Eye floated across the room and settled gently into Lyra's grasp. The eye is returned to the Night Court, the Archduchess decreed. Now go, before the rest of the world descends on my sovereign territory. Lyra clutched the eye and looked at Elias, her eyes filled with a new light. They were safe. The mission was complete. Outside the Fae embassy, Lyra stood with Elias, the dawn coloring the Vienna sky. The Crimson Eye was safe and Kalin had vanished. The Archduchess has provided us passage back to my mother's court, Lyra said, her voice soft. The journey will be long but safe. Elias looked at her, then at the eye. Your bindings will heal now that you have the eye's power. You won't need me anymore. Lyra stepped closer, laying the eye down on a marble bench. She took Elias's hand, her fingers tracing the scar on his shoulder where the Bone Seeker had struck him. My bindings will heal, yes. And I will no longer die if we separate, Lyra confirmed. But for months, Elias, your heartbeat was my only source of life. Your courage was the only thing that kept me fighting. I may not need your heat to survive, but I need your trust to rule." She looked at him, her silver eyes holding a depth of emotion Elias had never seen before. "You are more than a shield, Elias Vance. You are the architect of my survival, the proof of my new path. The tether of human warmth is broken, but the tether of our bond remains." She did not ask him to come with her. She simply waited. Elias looked from the magnificent, terrifying vampire princess to the glowing artifact that represented his terrifying, life-changing journey. He was a historian who had become a warrior, a human who had become the most important connection in a supernatural queen's life. He reached out and gently pulled Lyra back against him, their embrace now one of choice, not necessity. "The Citadel's libraries need a new historian," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And I think a queen needs a human advisor who knows how to spot a magical trap." Lyra leaned into his warmth, a warmth that was now utterly and completely hers. The crimson eye pulsed gently on the bench, casting a rosy glow over the newly tethered couple.